Cadia's significance within the Imperium of Man transcends mere strategic value. It represents humanity's unyielding defiance against the ruinous powers of chaos. Positioned at the mouth of the only stable navigational route from the Eye of Terror into the realm of the Emperor, the Cadian Gate represents the most vulnerable point in the boundary between real space and the immaterium. For millennia, this single world has shouldered the burden of being the Imperium's first and most critical line of defense against the nightmare realm that was once the heart of the Eldar Empire. The planet's location was not chosen by accident. Ancient star charts from before the Age of Strife indicate that Cadia sits at a cosmic crossroads, a nexus point where the fabric of reality thins. The Cadian Gate itself spans approximately 20 light-years, representing the only predictable passage through the otherwise impenetrable warp storms that rage around the Eye of Terror. This narrow corridor allows for stable warp travel, making it the primary invasion route for Chaos forces seeking to penetrate Imperial space, and consequently, the most heavily fortified region in the segmentum. Cadia's surface reflects its martial purpose. Unlike many Imperial worlds with a single dominant hive or a scattered collection of cities, Cadia boasts 8 primary fortress cities, each a masterpiece of defensive architecture. These massive urban complexes are referred to as cassers in the local dialect. Each casser is essentially a self-contained military installation capable of housing millions of soldiers and civilians, with walls hundreds of meters high, constructed from adamantium-reinforced ferrocrete that can withstand sustained bombardment from orbit. The architecture of these fortress cities embodies the Cadian philosophy of defense in depth. Streets are designed with clear firing lanes and pre-sighted artillery positions. Buildings feature reinforced bunkers and emergency shelters. Even civilian structures incorporate defensive elements, with few windows facing outward and multiple underground levels. Strategically positioned void shield generators protect critical infrastructure, while massive anti-orbital defense lasers crown the highest spires, capable of crippling or destroying enemy vessels that venture too close. Between these fortress cities stretches a landscape equally dedicated to war. The Cadian Interior Guard maintains thousands of smaller outposts, listening posts, and fire-based positions across the planet's surface. A network of hardened transit tunnels connects these installations, allowing for the rapid redeployment of forces even during the most intense bombardments. The planet's natural features have been extensively modified to serve defensive purposes: mountain ranges hollowed out to house massive macro cannons, plains dotted with tank traps and minefields, and valleys transformed into killing grounds with pre-registered artillery coordinates. The orbital defenses of Cadia represent perhaps the most formidable concentration of space-based weaponry in the Imperium outside of Terra itself. Multiple rings of defense platforms orbit the planet, each equipped with lance batteries, torpedo launchers, and nova cannons. These are supplemented by a fleet of monitor vessels, essentially mobile weapons platforms with minimal crews that can rapidly reposition to counter enemy movements. The Cadian System Defense Fleet, permanently stationed in orbit, comprises dozens of capital ships and hundreds of escort vessels, representing one of the largest standing naval forces in Imperial space. The martial culture that produced and maintains this fortress world is equally remarkable. From birth, Cadians are raised with the understanding that they exist to serve in the Emperor's armies. The phrase "born with a lasgun in hand" is not merely figurative on Cadia. Children begin weapons training as soon as they can walk, and basic tactical drills are taught alongside reading and writing in primary education. By the time a Cadian reaches adolescence, they have already mastered skills that would qualify them as veterans in the regiments of less militarized worlds. Formal military service begins with induction into the White Shields at age 14. These youth regiments serve as both training formations and reserve forces, attached to full shock troops regiments to gain battlefield experience. White Shields wear a distinctive white stripe on their helmets, marking them as troops who have yet to earn their shield, the right to wear the skull badge of a full Cadian trooper. This rite of passage typically occurs during their first combat engagement, assuming they survive. Those who distinguish themselves may be fast-tracked to non-commissioned officer status, or recommended for officer training at one of Cadia's prestigious military academies. The Cadian shock troops represent the elite of Imperial Guard forces across the galaxy. Their distinctive purple eyes, a mutation common to the Cadian population, theorized to result from proximity to the Eye of Terror, have become synonymous with martial excellence. Cadian training emphasizes discipline, marksmanship, and tactical flexibility. Their standard infantry kit includes flak armor of superior quality to that issued to most Imperial Guard regiments, often supplemented with carapace armor for veteran units. The standard issue Cadian pattern lasgun is renowned for its reliability and stopping power, modified with an integrated bayonet lug that reflects the Cadian preference for aggressive close-quarter fighting when necessary. The regimental structure of the Cadian military follows standard Imperial Guard organization, but with additional emphasis on combined arms operations. Cadian regiments regularly train together in battle group formations, developing the coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery that makes them so effective on the battlefield. The Cadian 8th, known as the Lord Castellan's Own, stands as perhaps the most decorated regiment in Imperial history, having fought in hundreds of campaigns across 10 millennia. This martial excellence is encapsulated in the famous Cadian ethos, most succinctly expressed in their battle cry, "Cadia stands." This simple phrase carries layers of meaning to those born under the shadow of the Eye. It speaks to the unbroken record of Cadia in repelling chaos incursions, to the individual soldier's duty to hold their position regardless of cost, and to the broader spiritual resistance against the corrupting influence of the warp. Cadian officers are known to execute soldiers who retreat without orders, but such measures are rarely necessary. Cadians typically fight to the death rather than yield ground to the enemies of mankind. The true secret to Cadia's successful resistance against chaos lies not merely in its formidable defenses or the quality of its soldiers, but in the mysterious structures that dot its surface, the pylons. These towering monoliths of black stone, reaching hundreds of meters into the sky, predate human settlement of the planet by millions of years. For most of Imperial history, their purpose remained unknown, though the Adeptus Mechanicus maintained research outposts to study them, and local folklore attributed protective properties to the structures. The truth, discovered only in recent millennia, is far more significant. The pylons are Necron technology, created during the war in heaven to contain and control the powers of the Imperium. The entire network forms a sophisticated system designed to reinforce the barriers between real space and the warp, actively suppressing psychic phenomena and stabilizing reality against warp intrusions. This explains Cadia's strategic importance beyond mere geography. The planet was specifically engineered by the Necrons to serve as a lock on what would eventually become the Eye of Terror. The pylon's effect is measurable and profound. Astropathic communication becomes difficult near the structures, and the manifestation of psychic powers is dampened. More importantly, the network creates a stabilizing effect on the surrounding region of space, preventing the Eye of Terror from expanding naturally and containing the warp storms that constantly rage at its edges. Without the pylons, the Eye would have consumed surrounding systems centuries ago, potentially triggering a cascading failure that could have threatened the entire segmentum. This function made Cadia the primary target for Abaddon, the Despoiler's Black Crusades. While Imperial propaganda portrays each crusade as a defeated invasion attempt, the truth is more complex. Several of Abaddon's campaigns, particularly the 7th and 8th Black Crusades, featured probing attacks against Cadia that were never intended as full-scale invasion attempts. Instead, they served to test Cadian defenses, gather intelligence on the pylons, and secure secondary objectives while diverting Imperial attention. The 7th Black Crusade, also known as the Ghost War, saw Abaddon's forces strike suddenly at the Cadian Gate in the year 811 of the 37th millennium. While the main thrust of this campaign targeted the Blood Angels chapter, drawing them into a devastating ambush at Macon, Cadia faced simultaneous raids by Chaos forces. These attacks targeted specific pylons, allowing the forces of the Despoiler to capture data and artifacts that would prove crucial to his later plans. The Cadian defense forces successfully repelled these incursions, but failed to recognize their true purpose, celebrating a victory that masked Abaddon's actual achievements. The Eighth Black Crusade in the year 999 of the 37th millennium featured a more direct assault on Cadia itself, with multiple Chaos fleets converging on the Cadian Gate. This campaign revealed Abaddon's growing understanding of the pylon's significance, as his forces specifically targeted research installations and monitoring stations near the major pylon clusters. The Cadian 88th Regiment earned particular distinction during this conflict, holding the Elysian Fields, site of one of the largest pylon concentrations, against a force of emperors' children 10 times their number for 17 days until reinforcements arrived. Throughout these and other conflicts, the Cadian defense forces demonstrated remarkable resilience and tactical acumen. The Cadian High Command, led by a succession of Lord Castellans, developed specialized doctrines for combating Chaos forces, including protocols for dealing with warp-based phenomena and demonic manifestations. These doctrines emphasized rapid response to incursions, overwhelming firepower to counter demons' regenerative abilities, and strict spiritual discipline to resist corruption. The Cadian Interior Guard became particularly adept at identifying and neutralizing cultist cells before they could sabotage defenses or summon demonic allies. Their counterintelligence operations extended throughout the Cadian Gate region, creating a network of informants and rapid response teams that could identify and eliminate Chaos influence before it took root. This vigilance extended to the Cadian population itself, with regular spiritual screening and psychological evaluation to detect early signs of corruption. Despite these measures, each Black Crusade left scars on Cadia. Certain regions of the planet became permanently quarantined after warp contamination, and several lesser casters were destroyed and never rebuilt. The population developed rituals and practices to cope with their proximity to the Eye of Terror, including distinctive facial tattoos that were believed to ward off corruption and regular prayer cycles timed to planetary defense alerts. Children born during periods of heightened warp activity were closely monitored for mutations, with the tainted typically given the Emperor's mercy. The ecclesiarchy maintained an unusually strong presence on Cadia, with cathedrals and shrines integrated into the defensive architecture of every caster. Faith served as both spiritual comfort and practical defense against Chaos influence, with Cadian regiments typically including a higher proportion of priests and confessors than those from other worlds. The famous Cadian battle hymn, Only in Death, became a standard part of Imperial Guard hymnals throughout the segmentum, its lyrics speaking to the Cadian acceptance of sacrifice as their birthright and duty. This combination of physical defenses, martial excellence, technological advantage, and spiritual fortitude allowed Cadia to withstand millennia of assaults by the forces of Chaos. The planet's survival represented more than merely holding a strategic position. It symbolized humanity's ability to stand against the darkness, to maintain order against the encroaching entropy of the warp. In Imperial propaganda, Cadia became synonymous with resilience, the ultimate example of the Emperor's protection and mankind's determination to survive in a hostile universe. The architect of Cadia's downfall did not craft his masterpiece overnight. Ezekiel Abaddon, once first captain of the Luna Wolves and right hand to Horus himself, emerged from the Eye of Terror not as a broken remnant of a failed rebellion, but as a new kind of threat, patient, calculating, and possessed of a vision that spanned millennia rather than mere centuries. Unlike his Gene father, whose ambition burned hot and fast, Abaddon's malice simmered across 10,000 years, each Black Crusade forming a carefully positioned piece in a game of regicide played against the Imperium on a galactic scale. The conventional Imperial narrative portrays each Black Crusade as a separate, failed attempt to break through the Cadian Gate. This interpretation, propagated by Imperial historians and ecclesiarchy preachers, fundamentally misunderstands the Despoiler's strategic approach. Each campaign served specific purposes within his grand design, gathering resources, testing defenses, eliminating threats, and positioning assets for future use. Abaddon studied the mistakes of Horus with the cold detachment of a true strategist, recognizing that direct confrontation with the full might of the Imperium would lead only to defeat. The First Black Crusade in the late 30th millennium established Abaddon's authority among the fragmented forces of chaos. By claiming the demon sword Drachnian and destroying loyalist Geneseed repositories on Harmony and Genesearch, he simultaneously secured his position as Warmaster and struck at the Imperium's ability to rebuild its transhuman defenders. The symbolic destruction of Horus's corpse during this campaign made clear that Abaddon was not merely continuing his Primarch's work, he was superseding it, learning from its failures. During the Second Black Crusade, Abaddon focused on eliminating potential rivals, particularly the clone of Horus created by the Emperor's children. This campaign consolidated his leadership while testing Imperial response patterns to major incursions. The Third and Fourth Black Crusades targeted specific Space Marine chapters that posed threats to his long-term objectives, the destruction of the Imperium's Geneseed stores, and the systematic elimination of Imperial fleet assets around the Eye of Terror. The Fifth Black Crusade revealed Abaddon's capacity for misdirection on a grand scale. While Imperial forces concentrated on defending Taranth against Doombreed's assault, Abaddon struck at the Ebon Keep, capturing thousands of slaves and sacrificial victims needed for rituals that would later prove crucial to his plans for Cadia. This pattern of feint and strike, repeated throughout subsequent crusades, the apocalyptic battles that draw Imperial attention frequently masked smaller, more significant operations elsewhere. The acquisition of the Blackstone fortresses during the Gothic War, officially recorded as the 12th Black Crusade, represented perhaps Abaddon's most significant achievement prior to Cadia's fall. These ancient weapons, known to the Eldar as the Talismans of Vol, were originally constructed to battle the Khatan star gods. In Abaddon's hands, they became both strategic assets and keys to understanding the technology of the Cadian pylons, as both shared the mysterious Blackstone material in their construction. The Gothic War began in the 139th year of the 41st millennium, when Abaddon's forces struck simultaneously at multiple systems in the Gothic sector. Imperial historians typically focus on the spectacular void battles and planetary assaults, but overlook the precision with which Abaddon targeted specific Archaeotech research stations and Adeptus Mechanicus facilities. Interrogation of captured tech priests provided crucial information about the Blackstone fortress's control systems, allowing Abaddon to seize control of these weapons. The power of the Blackstone fortresses became apparent when Abaddon used one to destroy the Tarantes star system, creating a shockwave that devastated nearby Imperial worlds. This demonstration served multiple purposes, testing the weapon's capabilities, eliminating strategic Imperial positions, and creating terror among Imperial populations. More importantly, it confirmed Abaddon's theories about the relationship between the fortresses and the Cadian pylons. Both technologies manipulated the barrier between real space and the warp, though to opposite ends, the pylons suppressed warp manifestations, while the fortresses could channel warp energy as weapons. Through the study of these captured weapons, Abaddon gained critical insights into the Necron technology underlying the Cadian pylons. The Despoiler understood what many Imperial scholars did not, that the pylons formed the linchpin of reality in the Cadian Gate region, the technological lock that kept the Eye of Terror contained. If they could be deactivated or destroyed, the Eye would expand uncontrollably, potentially engulfing entire sectors and creating a permanent warp rift that would split the Imperium in two. This knowledge shaped Abaddon's preparation for the 13th Black Crusade. He dispatched specialized agents to infiltrate Cadia and its surrounding systems years before the main assault began. These operatives, ranging from Alpha Legion sleeper cells to corrupted Imperial officials, gathered detailed information about pylon locations, defense protocols, and command structures. The Despoiler's network extended even into the upper echelons of the Cadian military, with several officers of the Cadian Interior Guard eventually revealed as cultists or unwitting pawns. Alongside these intelligence operations, Abaddon conducted an unprecedented diplomatic campaign within the Eye of Terror. The forces of chaos, by their nature, resist centralized authority and unified purpose. Previous Black Crusades had seen significant infighting among Chaos warbands, with rivalries between Chaos gods undermining military effectiveness. For the 13th Black Crusade, Abaddon employed a combination of threats, promises, and demonstrations of power to forge temporary alliances among traditionally antagonistic forces. The Despoiler's diplomatic efforts extended beyond the traditional Chaos legions. He secured the support of numerous renegade Space Marine chapters, including the Sons of Malice and the Violators. Dark Mechanicum Forge worlds within the Eye provided specialized war machines and demon engines in unprecedented numbers. Covenant with the Dark Eldar Homunculi cults of the Coven of the 13 Scars brought exotic weapons and torturous devices that would sow terror among Imperial defenders. Even the traitor Titan legions set aside their internal conflicts, with the Legio Vulcanum and Legio Mortis committing their god machines to the campaign. Most significantly, Abaddon secured the participation of multiple demon primarchs, an achievement previously thought impossible given their conflicting allegiances and agendas. Mortarion of the Death Guard, Angron of the World Eaters, and Fulgrim of the Emperor's children all committed forces to the Crusade, though each pursued secondary objectives aligned with their patron god's interests. The Night Lords, despite their traditional independence, joined in significant numbers, drawn by the promise of terror and slaughter on an unprecedented scale. These alliances were not built on mutual trust or shared vision, concepts alien to the followers of Chaos, but on Abaddon's careful manipulation of each faction's desires and fears. To Khorne's followers, he promised blood and skulls beyond counting. To Nurgle's children, he offered fertile ground for plagues in the densely populated Imperial worlds beyond Cadia. Slaaneshi forces were enticed by the exquisite suffering that would result from the campaign, while Tzeentchian warbands recognized the complex scheming as worthy of their patron's approval. Abaddon maintained his independence from any single Chaos god, drawing power from the ruinous powers collectively while pledging allegiance to none. This precarious balance, maintained over 10 millennia, represents one of his most remarkable achievements. Where other champions inevitably succumb to their patron's influence, becoming little more than extensions of their god's will, Abaddon preserved his agency and purpose. This independence allowed him to coordinate the disparate forces of Chaos in a way no demon primarch or god-specific champion could achieve. The Council of the Demon Oracle Zaraphistan proved invaluable in maintaining this balance. Once a senior librarian of the Thousand Suns, Zaraphistan had ascended to demonhood through the accumulation of forbidden knowledge rather than martial prowess. His ability to interpret the shifting currents of the warp provided Abaddon with strategic foresight that bordered on precognition. In the decades before the 13th Black Crusade, Zaraphistan's prophecies became increasingly specific, identifying the precise alignment of warp currents that would favor an assault on the Cadian Gate. These prophecies spoke of a crimson path that would open through the Empyrean, allowing unprecedented numbers of Chaos vessels to navigate safely to real space. They foretold the awakening of the blind on Cadia itself, a reference to dormant Chaos cults that would rise at the critical moment. Most significantly, they described the shattering of the Black Pillars and the subsequent sundering of the Veil, clear references to the destruction of the pylons and the expansion of the Eye of Terror. Other seers and prophets throughout the Eye contributed their visions to Abaddon's planning. The Dark Apostle Erebus, architect of Horus's corruption, provided interpretations of the Book of Lorgar that pointed to specific vulnerabilities in the Imperial defense network. The Thousand Suns sorcerer Ahriman, pursuing his own agenda involving the Black Library, nevertheless shared certain divinations that aligned with Abaddon's goals. Even the Eldar Farseers inadvertently contributed, as their increased activity around the Eye telegraphed their own apocalyptic visions to those who knew how to interpret such movements. The material preparations for the 13th Black Crusade matched its spiritual and political foundations in scale and thoroughness. The shipyards of Coriolan turned out Chaos warships by the hundreds, many incorporating archaeotech recovered during previous crusades. The forges of Zana II produced specialized siege weapons designed specifically to overcome Cadian defenses, including warp-touched artillery pieces capable of bypassing void shields through dimensional displacement. countless cultists across the Imperium's fringe worlds were activated to create diversionary uprisings that would stretch Imperial responses thin. The planet Killer, Abaddon's massive flagship, underwent extensive modifications incorporating technology derived from the Blackstone fortresses. These enhancements increased both its destructive capability and its resistance to warp suppression effects, ensuring it could operate at full capacity even in proximity to the Cadian pylons. The vessel's arboretum decks were converted into holding pens for thousands of psychers, their combined power harnessed to maintain warp storms and disrupt Imperial communications. Beyond conventional military assets, Abaddon gathered esoteric weapons specifically designed to target the pylons. The Cursed Casket of Maleficarum, containing bound demonic entities whose nature was antithetical to the pylon's Necron technology, would be deployed to disrupt the structure's energy matrices. The Tyrant's Claw, a massive warp cannon constructed from the remains of an Eldar vessel that once battled the Necrons, could theoretically overload the pylon's containment systems. These specialized weapons represented centuries of research and preparation, all focused on the single goal of neutralizing Cadia's ancient guardians. The final component of Abaddon's preparation came in the form of precise intelligence about Imperial force deployments throughout the segmentum. Through a network of spies, compromised astropaths, and corrupted naval officers, the Despoiler possessed an accurate assessment of the Imperium's defensive capabilities. He knew which battle groups could respond within what timeframes, which Space Marine chapters maintained forces near the Cadian Gate, and which Imperial commanders would be making critical decisions once the assault began. This intelligence allowed for precise targeting of key Imperial assets in the opening phases of the Crusade. The St. Josmund's Hope prison facility, containing thousands of battle-hardened veterans who could have reinforced Cadia, was destroyed before its inmates could be armed and deployed. Monitoring stations throughout the Cadian Gate region were systematically eliminated, blinding Imperial forces to the true scale of the Chaos fleet movements. Supply convoys bound for Fortress worlds were intercepted, ensuring that many Imperial positions would face shortages of ammunition and provisions during the prolonged campaign. As the 999th year of the 41st millennium drew to a close, all elements of Abaddon's grand design stood ready. The largest Chaos fleet ever assembled waited at the edge of the Eye of Terror, hidden from Imperial augurs by carefully maintained warp storms. Cultist networks throughout the sector stood poised to rise up at the appointed signal. The Blackstone fortresses, keys to understanding and destroying the pylons, were positioned for maximum strategic effect. 10,000 years of planning, 12 previous crusades, and countless sacrifices had led to this moment, the threshold of what Abaddon intended to be his final assault on the fortress world of Cadia. The Despoiler's message to his assembled forces was characteristically direct. The false emperor's gate shall fall. The stars themselves shall tremble. 10,000 years of waiting end today. The first signs of the impending catastrophe manifested not as military movements, but as disturbances in the Imperium itself. Beginning in early 999th year of the 41st millennium, astropaths across the Cadian sector reported increasing difficulty in sending and receiving messages, with transmissions becoming garbled or lost entirely. The distinctive green-tinged auroras that occasionally flickered above Cadia's polar regions, long considered a normal phenomenon near the Eye of Terror, became more frequent and intense, spreading toward the equatorial regions where they had never before been seen. Warp storms proliferated throughout the region with alarming speed. The Garan Nebula, long a stable passage for Imperial shipping, became effectively impassable as reality tore and stitched itself back together in unpredictable patterns. Navigator houses reported that established warp routes were shifting or vanishing entirely, forcing vessels to take longer, more dangerous paths. The Cadian High Command, well versed in recognizing the patterns preceding Chaos incursions, ordered an immediate escalation to war-footing Alpha across all Cassers. Reports of demonic manifestations increased exponentially in the months that followed. The mining colony on Tabor witnessed the spontaneous combustion of its entire population center when a bloodthirster materialized in the primary habitat dome. On Ulthar Station, an orbital monitoring post, the crew descended into madness after reporting faces in the void pressing against the viewports. Even on Cadia itself, where the pylons typically suppress such phenomena, sanctioned psychers of the Scholastica Psychona began experiencing seizures during which they spoke in tongues unknown to Imperial lexicographers. The most disturbing incidents occurred in the underhive regions of Kasser Partox, where entire districts reported hearing whispers emanating from drainage systems. Cadian Interior Guard units dispatched to investigate discovered elaborate shrines constructed from human remains, their configurations matching no known chaos cult patterns in Imperial records. More concerning was the discovery that many of these cultists bore the genetic markers of true Cadians, not off-world laborers or recent immigrants, but individuals whose lineage stretched back generations on the fortress world. Lord Castellan Creed, Supreme Commander of Cadia's military forces, recognized these signs for what they were, the opening moves of Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade. Creed had risen from the orphan survivor of a chaos raid to become Cadia's foremost military leader, his tactical genius matched only by his unwavering dedication to the planet's defense. He immediately ordered the activation of sleeper regiments and the recall of all Cadian forces operating in neighboring sectors. Creed's preparations were methodical and comprehensive. Civilian populations were evacuated from outlying settlements into the most defensible cassers. Artillery emplacements that had stood dormant for centuries were recommissioned and crewed. The orbital defense grid underwent emergency recalibration to counter expected attack vectors based on previous Chaos fleet movements. Most importantly, Creed ordered increased security around the major pylon sites, though the true significance of these structures remained unknown to him. Even as these preparations accelerated, unexpected reinforcements arrived from an almost mythical source. Saint Celestine, the living saint of the Adeptus Sororitas, appeared in the skies above Kasserkraft, accompanied by a blinding light that temporarily disrupted warp-based communications across the entire hemisphere. Witnesses described her descent as a column of golden fire that parted the increasingly turbulent storm clouds that had gathered over the fortress city. Celestine's arrival electrified the defenders of Cadia. Her very presence, radiating tangible waves of faith and determination, strengthened the resolve of Imperial forces preparing for the coming onslaught. More practically, she brought with her a cadre of battle sisters from the Order of Our Martyred Lady, veterans of countless campaigns against the forces of chaos. These warriors, clad in obsidian power armor adorned with symbols of Imperial faith, immediately took up positions at the most vulnerable defensive points. The living saint revealed to Lord Castellan Creed that her journey to Cadia had been guided by visions granted by the Emperor himself. These visions showed Cadia standing at the precipice of destruction, but also hinted at a possible salvation hidden within the planet itself. Celestine spoke of ancient sentinels, whose power could bind the Eye of Madness if properly awakened, a clear reference to the pylons, though couched in the symbolic language typical of Imperial prophecy. Most significantly, Celestine warned that the coming assault would differ fundamentally from previous Black Crusades. Abaddon had discovered some crucial weakness in Cadia's defenses, some vulnerability that had remained hidden for millennia. The nature of this vulnerability remained unclear even to her, but the urgency of her warning prompted Creed to dispatch specialized reconnaissance units to survey the pylon network for any signs of tampering or degradation. The second unexpected arrival proved equally significant, though considerably more controversial among Cadia's leadership. Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call, a senior tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose age was measured in millennia rather than centuries, approached the Cadian system aboard the Arch Mechanicus vessel Zar Quisitor. Initial Vox communications revealed that Call possessed information crucial to Cadia's defense, though he refused to elaborate further until granted personal audience with both Creed and Celestine. Call's massive, multi-limbed form, more machine than man after thousands of years of augmentation, created an imposing presence when he finally strode into the strategic command center of Kasserkraft. The ancient tech priest brought with him a sealed stasis container of clearly non-imperial design, its surface inscribed with geometric patterns that seem to shift subtly when viewed from different angles. This container, Call explained, held what he called the Cadian pylon matrix keystone, a device that could potentially amplify the pylon's reality-stabilizing effect. The Archmagos revealed that he had spent centuries studying the pylons, conducting clandestine research that sometimes operated at the boundaries of what the Mechanicus would consider tech heresy. His findings confirmed what some had long suspected. The pylons were Necron technology, created to suppress the warp and reinforce the barriers between dimensions. More importantly, Call had determined that the network was operating at a fraction of its intended capacity. Its power diminished over millions of years as the structures fell out of alignment or suffered damage. The keystone, Call claimed, could reactivate the entire network at full power, potentially pushing back the Eye of Terror itself and creating a permanent barrier against chaos incursions. However, the device required deployment at a specific control node hidden beneath Cadia's surface, and the activation sequence would temporarily disrupt the pylon's current functioning, creating a window of vulnerability that Abaddon would certainly exploit if aware of their activities. This revelation created immediate tension among Cadia's leadership. The potential to strengthen the planet's defenses permanently had to be weighed against the risk of temporarily weakening them during what promised to be the most massive chaos assault in Imperial history. After hours of debate, Celestine's endorsement of Call's plan proved decisive. The living saint confirmed that her visions aligned with the Archmagos' claims, suggesting that the Emperor himself had guided both of them to Cadia for this purpose. Even as these discussions unfolded, Imperial reinforcements began arriving in response to Cadia's astropathic distress calls. The first major fleet to reach the system belonged to the Imperial Fists chapter, led by Captain Torgaradin aboard the battle barge Spear of Vengeance. The Sons of Dorn, with their expertise in defensive warfare, immediately integrated into Cadia's fortification efforts, reinforcing key positions and establishing secondary fallback points should the primary defensive lines fail. Garradin brought troubling news from beyond the Cadian Gate. Warp storms were intensifying throughout the segmentum, hampering Imperial reinforcement efforts. Many of the battle groups that had pledged support were delayed or lost entirely in the increasingly turbulent Imperium. The Imperial Fists themselves had lost 2 escort vessels during their journey, with navigator reports describing warp predators of unprecedented size hunting Imperial ships with apparent intelligence and coordination. The arrival of a Black Templar's Crusade fleet days later brought both reinforcements and confirmation of these reports. Marshal Marius Amalrich, leading over 500 battle brothers of the eternally crusading chapter, had fought his way through warp storms that his navigators described as walls of screaming souls. 3 of the Templars' strike cruisers had been lost, and the remaining vessels showed battle damage not from conventional weapons, but from what appeared to be direct contact with warp energies, their hulls scored with symbols that burned the eyes of those who looked upon them too long. The Dark Angels arrived next, their approach characteristically unannounced, and their numbers undisclosed. Grand Master Belial of the Deathwing led the contingent, bringing with him veterans clad in bone-white Terminator armor, whose experience fighting chaos stretched back centuries. The Dark Angels established their command post separate from the other Imperial forces, a common practice for this secretive chapter, though they coordinated their defensive preparations with uncharacteristic openness, a testament to the severity of the threat. The Space Wolves, ancient rivals of the Dark Angels, arrived shortly thereafter aboard a flotilla of strike cruisers led by the battle barge Allfather's Honor. Wolflord Orvan Heifel commanded the force, bringing with him 4 great companies of the Sons of Russ. The Space Wolves immediately claimed the northern defensive quadrant of Kasserkraf as their territory, establishing fortifications that incorporated their traditional runic wards alongside standard Imperial defenses. As these Astartes forces integrated into Cadia's defense network, Imperial Navy battle groups continued to arrive despite the increasingly hazardous warp conditions. Admiral Quarren's battle fleet Cadia formed the core of the Orbital Defense Force, supplemented by elements of Battle Fleet Gothic and Battle Fleet Solar. The combined Imperial fleet represented one of the largest concentrations of naval power seen outside the solar system in centuries, with over 20 capital ships and hundreds of escorts and attack craft. Lord Castellan Creed, recognizing the need for unified command despite the disparate nature of the arriving forces, established a war council comprising representatives from each major imperial contingent. This council met daily in the armored stratageum beneath Kasser Craft, coordinating defensive preparations and intelligence gathering. The Space Marine chapter masters and captains, normally resistant to non-Astartes command, accepted Creed's authority with minimal reservation, another indication of how seriously they viewed the coming conflict. The intelligence presented at these councils grew increasingly dire. Augur stations throughout the Cadian Gate region reported massive warp signature disturbances consistent with the approach of a vast fleet. Long-range reconnaissance craft detected the energy signatures of multiple Blackstone fortresses moving into position near the Eye of Terror. Most concerning were reports from deep-cover inquisitorial agents, suggesting that Chaos forces had somehow obtained detailed schematics of Cadia's defensive networks, including information about the pylons that even most Imperial commanders lacked. Preparations accelerated as these reports crystallized into certainty. Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade had begun, and Cadia stood directly in its path. Archmago's Call, working with teams of Mechanicus adepts and Cadian engineers, began the delicate process of locating the central control node for the pylon network. Saint Celestine led daily prayer ceremonies that bolstered morale among the defenders, while simultaneously serving as psychic bulwarks against the increasing warp disturbances affecting the planet. The Imperial forces on Cadia now represented one of the most formidable concentrations of military power in the Imperium's history. Over 3 million Cadian shock troops stood ready in the fortress cities, supported by tens of thousands of Astartes from multiple chapters. The orbital defense grid bristled with weapons capable of crippling even the largest Chaos vessels, while the combined Imperial fleet maintained constant patrol patterns designed to detect and intercept approaching enemies from any vector. Yet despite this unprecedented military might, an atmosphere of grim fatalism pervaded the War Council meetings. The defenders of Cadia understood that they faced not merely another Black Crusade, but the culmination of Abaddon's 10,000-year campaign against the Imperium. The Despoiler had never committed such resources to previous assaults, never coordinated his forces with such precision, never struck with such clear purpose. Whatever the outcome of the coming battle, all recognized that the galaxy would be forever changed by the events about to unfold on the fortress world of Cadia. The first wave of Abaddon's assault struck with calculated precision rather than overwhelming force. Chaos warships emerged from the swirling maelstrom of the Eye of Terror, not as a unified armada, but as dozens of smaller battle groups targeting specific strategic assets throughout the Cadian Gate. Monitoring Station Vigilant, the primary early warning system for the sector, detected the initial emergence before a concentrated lance barrage from 3 Carnage-class cruisers reduced it to superheated debris. Within hours, 17 similar monitoring stations had been destroyed, effectively blinding Imperial forces to the true scale and disposition of the Chaos fleet. Defense platform Sigma Prioris, one of the largest orbital installations protecting the approaches to Cadia, came under attack from a specialized boarding force of Night Lords. The platform's commander, Admiral Lionel Hardigan, ordered a fighting retreat to the command center, but found the route blocked by Chaos forces that had somehow bypassed the primary security cordons. Subsequent investigation revealed that maintenance servitors had been corrupted months earlier, their machine spirits gradually rewritten to recognize the Night Lord's encryption codes as friendly. The platform fell within 6 hours, its formidable weapons turned against nearby Imperial vessels. The systematic neutralization of Cadia's outer defense network continued with ruthless efficiency. The Ramleys-class star Fort Martyr's Rampart, which had withstood 7 previous Black Crusades, faced a concentrated assault by elements of the Black Legion. Rather than attempting to capture the installation, the attackers focused on destroying its generatorium complexes and life support systems. When Imperial Navy reinforcements arrived 27 hours later, they found the star fort intact but devoid of life, its corridors filled with frozen corpses still at their battle stations. These precise strikes demonstrated Abaddon's intimate knowledge of Imperial defense protocols. Each attack targeted facilities critical to the coordination of Cadia's defensive network, systematically dismantling the early warning systems that would have provided crucial intelligence about the main Chaos fleet's composition and heading. Lord Admiral Quarren, commanding the Imperial naval forces, found himself fighting blind, unable to determine where the Despoiler's primary thrust would fall until it was too late to properly counter it. The Void battle escalated dramatically with the arrival of Abaddon's main fleet 5 days after the initial strikes. The Chaos Armada emerged from the Eye of Terror in a formation that naval strategists would later describe as the Crimson Scythe, a vast crescent of capital ships with specialized destroyer squadrons positioned at regular intervals along its arc. At the formation's center loomed the Planet Killer, Abaddon's monstrous flagship, flanked by 2 blackstone fortresses whose black surfaces seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light of Cadia's sun. Battlefleet Cadia moved to intercept, forming a defensive sphere around the planet, with the heaviest ships positioned to meet the center of the Chaos formation. Lord Admiral Quarren, aboard the Emperor-class battleship Divine Right, ordered a concentrated Nova cannon barrage targeting the Planet Killer. The massive shells crossed the void in perfect formation, only to detonate prematurely as they encountered a previously undetected screen of warp energy protecting the Chaos flagship. The detonations illuminated dozens of smaller Chaos vessels hiding in the Planet Killer's shadow, which immediately broke formation to engage the Imperial escorts. The resulting Void battle engulfed the entire Cadian system. Imperial Navy tactical doctrine, emphasizing concentrated firepower and coordinated squadron actions, initially proved effective against the more individualistic Chaos captains. Battlegroup Agrippa, comprising 3 Mars-class battlecruisers and their escorts, successfully executed a pincer movement that destroyed a Word-bearer's strike cruiser and its attendant vessels. Battlegroup Tyros, led by the venerable Grand Cruiser Imperius, held the line against a Death Guard assault squadron, its void shields flaring constantly under the impact of plague-infused macrocannon shells. These early successes proved short-lived. As the battle progressed, the Chaos fleet revealed unprecedented levels of coordination. Ships bearing the markings of traditionally rivalrous Chaos factions executed complex maneuvers in perfect synchronization, suggesting a command structure more sophisticated than any previously encountered during a Black Crusade. When Battlegroup Agrippa attempted to disengage for repairs, they found their retreat vectors blocked by Alpha Legion cruisers that had anticipated their movement. All 3 battlecruisers were lost with all hands. The most devastating blow came when 3 previously undetected space hulks emerged from behind Cadia's largest moon. These massive conglomerations of fused vessels and debris had been carefully positioned days earlier, their presence masked by specialized warp tech developed by the Dark Mechanicum. Each hulk carried thousands of Chaos boarding torpedoes, which launched simultaneously toward the rear echelon of the Imperial formation, where the support vessels and hospital ships were stationed. The resulting massacre destroyed nearly 30% of Battlefleet Cadia's logistics capacity in a single hour. The hospital ship Mercy of Terra, carrying over 15,000 wounded from earlier engagements, was boarded by World Eater's berserkers who butchered patients and medical staff alike. The munitions tender Emperor's Bounty detonated after cultists reached its main magazine, the explosion damaging 2 nearby Gothic-class cruisers and creating a debris field that hampered Imperial maneuvering for the remainder of the battle. By the battle's 3rd day, the Imperial fleet had been forced into a defensive posture directly above Cadia itself. Lord Admiral Quarren ordered all remaining vessels to focus on protecting the planet rather than engaging the Chaos fleet, effectively ceding control of the outer system. This decision, while tactically sound given the circumstances, allowed Abaddon to establish staging areas on Cadia's moons and the neighboring mining world of Macheria, from which he could launch the ground assault at his leisure. The planetary assault began with a bombardment unlike anything witnessed in previous Black Crusades. Rather than targeting military installations or population centers, the initial barrage focused exclusively on locations where the Cadian pylons stood. Specialized warheads containing warp-resonant materials struck the areas surrounding the pylons, creating localized reality distortions that weakened the structure's foundations. This bombardment confirmed what Archmago's call had already suspected. Abaddon understood the pylon's significance and had developed specific weapons to counter them. Following this preparatory bombardment, Chaos landing craft descended on Cadia in staggering numbers. Conservative estimates from Imperial tacticians placed the first wave at over 3 million combatants, ranging from simple cultists to traitor Astartes and demon engines. Unlike previous assaults, which had concentrated on the major cassers, this attack dispersed across the planet's surface, with specific detachments targeting each known pylon site. The pattern suggested a coordinated effort to control or destroy the entire network simultaneously, preventing Imperial forces from reinforcing any single location. The ground war quickly devolved into hundreds of separate battles raging across Cadia's surface. Outside Kasser Kraf, the 8th Cadian Regiment faced a massive force of Iron Warriors supported by Decimator demon engines. The Iron Warriors, masters of siege warfare, established firing positions with mathematical precision, their heavy ordnance systematically targeting the Kasser's void shield generators. Captain Harkin's Leman Russ Company executed a desperate flanking maneuver that temporarily disrupted the bombardment, but was eventually surrounded and destroyed by traitor titans of the Legio Vulcanum. In the Elysian Fields, site of one of the largest pylon clusters, the Black Templars under Marshal Amalrich engaged a Word-Bearer's force led by the Dark Apostle Marduk. The battle centered around a massive pylon whose surface had begun displaying unusual energy patterns following the orbital bombardment. The Templars fought with characteristic zeal, their charge breaking the first line of Word-Bearer's defenses, but found themselves confronted by summoned demon cohorts that materialized directly within their formation. Marshal Amalrich and his command squad fought their way to the central pylon, only to witness Dark Mechanicum Tech priests attaching warp-resonant devices to its structure. The northern continent became the domain of the Death Guard, whose advance was preceded by clouds of toxic miasma that killed all living things they touched. The 203rd Cadian Regiment, supported by elements of the Space Wolves Blackmane Great Company, established a defensive line along the Urgal Depression. For 17 hours, they held against waves of plague marines and shambling poxwalkers, their ranks gradually thinning as the contagions unleashed by Mortarian's sons infected even those not directly engaged in combat. Wolf Lord Orvan Heifel led a counterattack that temporarily pushed the Death Guard back, but the effort cost the lives of over half his battle brothers. Throughout these engagements, Lord Castellan Creed demonstrated the tactical genius that had made him legendary among Imperial commanders. From his command center beneath Kasser Kraf, he directed reinforcements with uncanny precision, seemingly anticipating chaos movements before they occurred. When an Alpha Legion force threatened to overrun the southern defensive perimeter, Creed had already positioned the 55th Cadian Artillery Regiment to bombard their approach vector. When Death Guard plague tanks broke through the Urgal line, the Cadian 112th Armored was already moving to seal the breach. This mastery of battlefield dynamics led some to question whether Creed possessed some form of prophetic ability, but the truth was more prosaic and perhaps more impressive. Decades of fighting chaos forces had given the Lord Castellan an intuitive understanding of their tactics and preferences. He recognized patterns in their deployments that other commanders missed, allowing him to position his limited reserves for maximum effect. As he reportedly told his staff officers, "The enemy's movements tell us their intentions. We need only listen." Creed's most critical decision came when reports confirmed that Chaos forces were specifically targeting the pylons. Recognizing that these structures represented Cadia's true strategic value, he ordered a significant redeployment, pulling forces from the defense of several secondary cassers to reinforce the major pylon sites. This decision effectively sacrificed portions of Cadia's population and infrastructure, to protect assets whose importance many of his subordinates didn't fully understand, earning him criticism from some planetary officials. The wisdom of this choice became apparent when Archmago's call reported a disturbing development. The pylons under Chaos control had begun emitting energy signatures that interfered with the functioning of the entire network. Each captured pylon weakened the overall suppression effect, allowing warp phenomena to manifest with increasing frequency and intensity across the planet. In some locations, reality itself began to thin, with observers reporting glimpses of the Imperium bleeding through into real space. Saint Celestine proved invaluable in countering these manifestations. The living saint's presence naturally repelled warp entities, and her radiant faith strengthened the resolve of troops facing demonic adversaries. When a greater demon of Tzeentch materialized within the walls of Cassar itself, Celestine confronted the entity directly, her flaming sword cleaving through its protections and banishing it back to the warp. The battle left a portion of the Cassar permanently altered, its architecture twisted into impossible geometries that had to be quarantined. The most strategically significant engagement occurred at the Elysian Fields, where Belisarius Cawl had identified the central control node for the entire pylon network. A combined force of Dark Angels, Imperial Fists, and Cadian shock troops established a defensive perimeter around the site, while Cawl and his tech priests began the delicate process of accessing the ancient Necron systems. The Chaos forces, seemingly aware of the node's importance, committed significant resources to breaching this perimeter, including elements of the Black Legion led by Abaddon's foremost lieutenant, Arcanthos. The battle for the Elysian Fields exemplified the desperate nature of Cadia's defense. Imperial Fist Centurions held chokepoints against waves of cultists who threw themselves forward with no concern for self-preservation, their bodies creating ramps of flesh over which demon engines could advance. Dark Angel's Deathwing Terminators teleported directly into the midst of Black Legion formations, their storm bolters and lightning claws reaping a terrible toll before they were eventually overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Cadian heavy weapons teams maintained disciplined firing patterns even as the ground beneath them began to crack and shift from the reality warping effects of nearby combat. Despite these heroic efforts, the defensive perimeter gradually contracted as Chaos forces pressed their advantage. Lord Castellan Creed, recognizing the critical nature of Call's work, ordered all available reserves to the Elysian Fields, stripping other battlefronts to their minimum sustainable levels. This decision created opportunities that Chaos forces quickly exploited elsewhere on the planet, but Creed calculated that holding the central node took precedence over all other considerations. As the battle for Cadia intensified both on the ground and in orbit, one fact became increasingly clear to Imperial commanders. This was not merely another raid from the Eye of Terror, but a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to achieve specific strategic objectives. The methodical targeting of the pylons, the unprecedented coordination between traditionally rivalrous Chaos factions, and the precision of the initial strikes all pointed to a level of planning that spanned centuries rather than years or decades. The 13th Black Crusade had begun, and with it, the most significant test of Cadia's defenses in its long history as the Imperium's bulwark against Chaos. The fortress world, which had withstood millennia of assaults, now faced an enemy who understood its true strategic value and possessed both the knowledge and resources to exploit previously unknown vulnerabilities. As Lord Castellan Creed grimly observed to his command staff, "We have always known this day would come. Now we shall see if Cadia stands or falls." Lord Castellan Creed stood atop the highest spire of Cassar Craft, his weathered face illuminated by the flash of orbital bombardments that lit the sky like artificial lightning. The tactical genius who had risen from orphaned refugee to supreme commander of Cadia's military forces surveyed the battlefield through magnoculars, his expression betraying nothing of the calculations racing through his mind. Beneath his greatcoat, adorned with medals from 100 campaigns, he wore standard issue flak armor, refusing the artificer protection offered to officers of his rank. The Lord Castellan had always led from the front, and the defense of Cassar Craft would be no exception. Creed's tactical acumen had become legendary throughout the Imperium, with good reason. During the initial Chaos landings, he had anticipated the enemy's three-pronged assault on Cicatrix's eastern quadrant, positioning Hellhammer super heavy tanks at precisely the locations where traitor Astartes drop pods would later descend. The resulting ambush destroyed nearly half of the first wave before they could establish a foothold. When Death Guard plague bombardments threatened to overwhelm the northern defensive line, Creed had already ordered the 89th Cadian Armored to execute a flanking maneuver that caught the traitor forces in a devastating crossfire. This preternatural ability to predict enemy movements led many to whisper that Creed possessed some form of psychic foresight. The truth was both more mundane and more impressive. Decades of fighting Chaos had given him an intuitive understanding of their tactics that bordered on prescience. He recognized patterns in troop deployments that other commanders missed, identifying feints and detecting genuine assaults with seemingly impossible accuracy. Redeploy the 412th to Junction Primus, Creed ordered his Vox officer, his voice gruff from decades of shouting commands over the din of battle. The word-bearers will attempt to breach the southern wall within the hour. The officer hesitated momentarily. Junction Primus had shown no enemy activity, but transmitted the order without question. 43 minutes later, a word-bearer's assault force emerged from concealed tunnels precisely where Creed had predicted. The Lord Castellan's most audacious stratagem came during the third day of the siege, when he ordered the apparent abandonment of the Cregan gatehouses. Chaos forces surged forward to claim this strategic entry point, only to find themselves caught in a carefully prepared kill zone. Demolition charges collapsed the surrounding structures, while pre-sighted artillery batteries pounded the area with pinpoint accuracy. 3 traitor Astartes companies were effectively eliminated in less than 20 minutes, buying precious time for reinforcements to secure vulnerable sections of the Caesar's inner defenses. Even Abaddon's lieutenants learned to fear Creed's tactical mind. When the Chaos Lord Urcanthos led a spearhead assault against what intelligence identified as Cicatrix's command center, he found only servitor decoys and automated defense systems. The real command center had been relocated days earlier on Creed's orders, while the false one was rigged with vortex charges that consumed Urcanthos and his elite guard in a swirling rift of pure warp energy. Creed's leadership extended beyond tactical brilliance to a profound understanding of the troops under his command. He knew when the defenders needed to see their Lord Castellan on the firing line, bolstering morale through his physical presence. During the desperate defense of the Martyr's Rampart, Creed personally took command of a Shadow Sword super heavy tank when its crew was incapacitated, destroying 3 Chaos Predators before reinforcements could arrive. The sight of the Lord Castellan emerging from the smoking behemoth, coat singed but determination undiminished, inspired the surrounding troops to hold their positions against overwhelming odds. This balance of strategic oversight and frontline leadership made Creed the perfect commander for Cadia's darkest hour. He understood the strategic significance of the pylons that Belisarius Cawl sought to activate, but also recognized that the common soldiers needed more tangible motivations. His orders emphasized protecting civilian evacuation zones and sacred shrines alongside purely military objectives, giving his troops emotional anchors to reinforce their tactical directives. As effective as Creed's leadership proved, even he could not have held Cadia alone against Abaddon's onslaught. The arrival of Inquisitor Catarina, Greyfax of the Ordo Hereticus, provided crucial support, particularly in countering the insidious cultist activities that threatened to undermine Cadia's defenses from within. Greyfax cut an imposing figure as she strode through the corridors of Cicatrix, her power armor adorned with the emblems of her office and purity seals from 100 successful purges. Her face remained partially concealed behind a psycho-reactive mask that enhanced her already formidable interrogation abilities, while her eyes, cold and analytical, missed nothing. At her hip hung an ornate power sword whose blade flickered with disruptive energy fields calibrated specifically to sever the connection between demon and host. The Inquisitor's arrival on Cadia had not been planned. Her ship, returning from a classified mission in the Gothic sector, had been caught in the same warp storms that heralded Abaddon's assault. emergency translation into real space had brought her to Cadia just as the invasion began. Recognizing the significance of the situation, Greyfax immediately offered her services to the planetary defense effort, though her relationship with the other Imperial leaders proved initially contentious. This tension was particularly evident in her first encounter with Saint Celestine. Greyfax, with her Ordo Hereticus training, viewed the living saint with profound suspicion. The Inquisitor's empirical mind struggled to reconcile Celestine's miraculous abilities with orthodox Imperial doctrine. During their first war council, Greyfax openly questioned whether the saint might be a warp entity masquerading as an Imperial icon, a suggestion that nearly resulted in armed confrontation with Celestine's Sororitas honor guard. Despite these ideological conflicts, Greyfax's practical contributions to Cadia's defense proved invaluable. Her acolytes established a counterintelligence network that identified and eliminated 7 major cult cells operating within Cassarcraft during the first week of the siege. The most significant of these, the Brotherhood of the Ascending Dark, had infiltrated the Cassar's water purification system and planned to introduce warp-tainted chemicals that would have driven thousands of defenders to madness. Greyfax personally led the raid on the cult's hidden temple, accompanied by a kill team of Tempestus Scions. The battle that followed demonstrated why even Space Marines treated Inquisitors with cautious respect. When the cult leader, revealed as a possessed former Mechanicus adept, unleashed warp energies that incapacitated the Scions, Greyfax continued her advance alone. Her psychic null abilities disrupted the sorcerer's powers long enough for her to close the distance and execute him with a single precise thrust of her power sword. The Inquisitor's most significant contribution came through her methodical interrogation of captured cultists. Through a combination of psychic scanning, chemical enhancement, and traditional questioning techniques, Greyfax extracted crucial intelligence about Abaddon's overall strategy. It was through these interrogations that Imperial forces first learned of the Despoiler's specific interest in the pylons, information that proved vital to Lord Castellan Creed's defensive redeployments. As the siege progressed, Greyfax's initial hostility towards Saint Celestine gradually transformed into reluctant acceptance and eventually a form of guarded respect. The turning point came during the Battle of the Emperor's Grace, a massive cathedral complex in Cassarcraft's central district. Traitor forces had breached the outer defenses, and demonic entities were manifesting within the sacred precincts. Greyfax, leading a detachment of Cadian shock troops, found herself cut off and surrounded by warp-twisted abominations that her null abilities could only partially suppress. It was Celestine who descended into this maelstrom of chaos, her radiance burning away the demonic entities and rallying the defenders. The living saint fought alongside Greyfax for 17 hours, their contrasting abilities, one channeling the Emperor's light, the other negating warp energies, creating a formidable combination against the demonic forces. By the battle's end, Greyfax could no longer deny the evidence before her. Whatever Celestine might be, her presence served the Emperor's will. Saint Celestine herself represented perhaps the most visible symbol of Imperial resistance during the fall of Cadia. Her appearance, a towering figure in ornate golden armor, twin wings of pure light extending from her back, and the ardent blade blazing in her grip, inspired a level of devotion that transcended normal morale factors. Wherever the living saint appeared on the battlefield, Imperial forces fought with renewed determination, often achieving victories that tactical analysis would have deemed impossible. The nature of Celestine's powers remained a subject of debate among Imperial scholars. Her ability to heal grievous wounds with a touch, to inspire supernatural courage in those around her, and to smite demons with particular effectiveness suggested a direct connection to the Emperor's power. Yet unlike the primitive saints of ancient Terra, Celestine retained her individual identity and tactical acumen, directing her abilities with strategic precision rather than blind zealotry. This tactical intelligence was demonstrated most clearly during the defense of the Elysian fields. When Chaos forces threatened to overwhelm the Imperial positions around the central pylon cluster, Celestine did not simply charge into the thickest fighting as many might have expected. Instead, she identified the 3 critical junctures where her intervention would create maximum impact. Moving with supernatural speed between these positions, she stabilized the Imperial line long enough for Cadian reserves to reinforce the most vulnerable sectors. The Living Saints' most spectacular intervention came during the assault on the Cadian Interior Defense Network headquarters. A massive force of Emperor's children, led by the demon prince Usteroth the Beautifier, had breached the facility's outer defenses and threatened to capture the command systems that coordinated Cadia's automated defense grid. Celestine, accompanied only by her Gemini Superia, twin Sororitas warriors who served as her honor guard, descended into the heart of the Chaos formation. What followed was described by witnesses as more miracle than battle. The living saint moved through the traitor Astartes like a blade through smoke, her sword leaving trails of purifying fire that consumed corrupted flesh. When Usteroth himself confronted her, the demon prince's reality warping abilities met their match in Celestine's faith-manifested power. Their duel shattered reality around them, with observers reporting that the combatants seemed to phase between real space and some other dimension with each exchange of blows. Celestine's eventual triumph, driving her flaming sword through the demon prince's chest and causing his form to collapse into screaming warp energy, became an instant legend among Cadia's defenders. Preachers and commissars recounted the tale to bolster morale in the darkest moments of the subsequent fighting. More importantly, the victory secured the defense network headquarters, allowing Imperial forces to maintain coordination that would have otherwise been impossible against the overwhelming Chaos numbers. Beyond these individual heroes, the defense of Cadia also showcased the leadership of various Space Marine chapter masters who had answered the Fortress World's call for aid. Among these, Azrael of the Dark Angels proved particularly crucial to the overall Imperial strategy. The Supreme Grand Master of the Dark Angels arrived with a force that, while not numerically overwhelming, represented some of the finest warriors and most advanced equipment in the Imperium. Azrael himself, clad in artificer armor and bearing the relic sword known as the Sword of Secrets, established his command post in the ruins of Kasser Gallon, which had fallen during the initial Chaos assault. From this position, he coordinated not only his Dark Angels, but also elements of several successor chapters that had answered his call, including the Angels of Vengeance and Angels of Absolution. Azrael's contribution extended beyond mere combat prowess. His experience fighting Chaos, particularly the fallen angels that his chapter had hunted for millennia, gave him insights into traitor tactics that proved invaluable to the overall Imperial defense. When a Word-Bearer's force employed an unusual assault pattern against the western defenses of Kasser Kraf, Azrael immediately recognized it as a variant of a formation used during the Horus Heresy, allowing Imperial forces to counter appropriately. The Dark Angels' specialized units proved particularly effective against specific Chaos threats. The Ravenwing's land speeders and Black Knights executed lightning raids against Chaos artillery positions, preventing concentrated bombardment of key Imperial strongpoints. The Deathwing Terminators teleported directly into the heart of traitor Astartes' command structures, their Storm Bolters and Lightning Claws reaping a terrible toll before they extracted via Thunderhawk gunships. While Azrael coordinated the overall Space Marine response, Marshal Marius Amalrich of the Black Templars exemplified the direct approach for which his chapter was renowned. Leading over 500 battle brothers, Amalrich established a reputation for appearing at the most desperate points of conflict, his black armor and white tabard becoming a rallying point for beleaguered defenders. The Black Templars' zealous hatred of Chaos made them ideal shock troops against demonic incursions. When a major breach in Kasser Kraf's southern wall allowed a tide of Khornate demons to pour into the residential districts, Amalrich led his sword brethren in a direct countercharge. The clash between the Black Templars' righteous fury and the demons' blood-mad rage resulted in one of the most brutal close-quarters battles of the entire campaign. Though the Templars suffered nearly 40% casualties, they succeeded in containing the demonic incursion long enough for Cadian engineers to seal the breach. Amalrich's tactical flexibility belied the common perception of Black Templars as mere berserkers in the Emperor's name. When conventional assaults proved ineffective against the heavily fortified Chaos positions around the Martyr's Gate, the Marshal implemented a complex strategy involving subterranean infiltration teams and precisely timed artillery barrages. The resulting victory allowed Imperial forces to reclaim a strategic artery that reconnected two previously isolated defense sectors. The combined efforts of these heroes, Creed's tactical genius, Greyfax's counterintelligence operations, Celestine's inspiring presence, and the Space Marine leader's combat prowess, created a synergy that allowed Imperial forces to resist far beyond what objective analysis would have predicted possible. Each brought unique strengths that compensated for others' limitations, forming a leadership cadre that maximized the effectiveness of every available asset. This cooperation did not come without tension. Greyfax's initial suspicion of Celestine created friction that occasionally threatened to undermine joint operations. Azrael's secretive nature and tendency to prioritize objectives known only to the Dark Angels sometimes conflicted with Creed's broader strategic needs. Amalrich's zealous aggression occasionally outpaced the support capabilities of the Cadian regiments assigned to fight alongside his Templars. The ancient weapons known as Blackstone fortresses represented one of the most enigmatic and potent technologies in the galaxy, their origins predating even the rise of mankind. First encountered by Imperial forces during the Gothic War in the 36th millennium, these massive star-shaped constructs were originally designated as talismans of Vol in Eldar records. The Eldar myth cycle described them as weapons forged by their smith god Vol to battle the Khatan star gods during the ancient war in heaven, a conflict that had shaped the galaxy millions of years before human civilization emerged from Terra. Each Blackstone fortress measured approximately 12 kilometers from stem to stern, with a distinctive star-shaped configuration featuring 6 massive armored pylon structures radiating from a central core. Their hull material, the mysterious Blackstone that gave them their Imperial designation, possessed unique properties that interacted with both real space and the warp in ways that even the most accomplished tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus struggled to comprehend. The original purpose of these constructs became clearer during the Necron Awakening in the late 41st millennium. Blackstone possessed the remarkable ability to either amplify or nullify warp energies depending on its polarization. In their original configuration, the Blackstone fortresses served as weapons against the Khatan, channeling the energy of the Immaterium against beings that existed purely in the Materium. This fundamental duality made Blackstone one of the most strategically valuable materials in the galaxy, and explained why both the Necrons and forces of Chaos sought control of it. During the Gothic War, Abaddon had captured several of these ancient weapons, using one to destroy the Terrantes star system by triggering its sun to go supernova. While Imperial records claimed that all the Blackstone fortresses had been accounted for after that conflict, with most destroyed or disabled, this information proved fatally incorrect. Abaddon had preserved at least one fully functional fortress, keeping it hidden within the Eye of Terror for centuries while he studied its mechanisms and prepared it for his ultimate assault on Cadia. This surviving fortress, which Abaddon named the Will of Eternity, underwent extensive modifications under the direction of Dark Mechanicum tech priests and Chaos sorcerers. The original systems, designed to channel warp energy as a weapon against material targets, were reconfigured to generate a concentrated beam of Immaterium energy that could destabilize the unique properties of the Cadian pylons. The technical complexity of these modifications was staggering, requiring a fusion of technological expertise and sorcerous knowledge that only Abaddon, with his millennia of preparation, could have orchestrated. The Will of Eternity represented more than merely a powerful weapon in Abaddon's arsenal. It embodied the culmination of his strategic vision across 12 previous Black Crusades. During the Gothic War, his primary objective had never been territorial conquest, but rather the capture of the Blackstone fortresses and the knowledge of how they functioned. The destruction he wreaked throughout the Gothic sector served mainly to mask this true purpose from Imperial intelligence. Abaddon's deployment of the Will of Eternity during the 13th Black Crusade demonstrated his comprehensive understanding of the Cadian defense network. Rather than using the fortress as a conventional weapon against Imperial ships or ground installations, he positioned it specifically to target the subterranean energy matrix that connected the major pylon sites. This precision targeting required detailed knowledge of the pylon's locations and functions, information that no outside force should have possessed. The question of how Abaddon acquired such detailed intelligence remained a disturbing mystery to Imperial commanders. Some evidence suggested the involvement of the Dark Mechanicum Forge world of Caronia, whose tech priests had conducted forbidden research into Necron technology for millennia. Other intelligence pointed to possible Eldar involvement, specifically the craftworld Ulthwé, whose Farseers had long monitored the Cadian Gate and may have inadvertently revealed crucial information through their own preventative actions against the Necrons. The Will of Eternity first revealed itself 3 weeks into the siege of Cadia, emerging from behind the largest of Cadia's moons, where it had remained concealed by a combination of technological stealth systems and warp-based concealment rituals. Its appearance sent shockwaves through the Imperial command structure. Lord Admiral Quarren, commanding the remnants of Battlefleet Cadia, immediately recognized the threat and diverted all available capital ships to intercept the massive construct before it could move into firing position. The battle group led by the Emperor-class battleship Divine Authority was the first to engage the Blackstone Fortress. The Divine Authority launched a full spread of torpedoes, while its escorts moved to flanking positions, attempting to overwhelm the fortress's void shields through concentrated fire. The torpedoes detonated harmlessly against previously undetected defensive fields that surrounded the Will of Eternity at a distance of several thousand kilometers. These fields, incorporating technology looted from Eldar and Necron sources, created a layered defense that conventional Imperial weapons struggled to penetrate. The fortress responded with weapons unlike anything previously documented in Imperial tactical databases. Beams of pure blackness lanced out from its 6 pylons, leaving contrails of what appeared to be liquid shadow in the void. Where these beams struck Imperial vessels, they didn't merely damage hull plating or overload void shields. They created localized reality distortions that caused portions of the ships to phase partially into the warp. Gun crews aboard the light cruiser Righteous Fury reported seeing their own ship from the outside through sudden tears in reality, while still standing at their posts. The Divine Authority itself suffered catastrophic damage when one of these shadow beams struck its command bridge. Survivors described the beam passing through void shields as if they didn't exist, creating a sphere of absolute darkness that consumed everything it touched. When the darkness dissipated, everything within a 100-meter radius, including the ship's command staff and primary control systems, had vanished, leaving a perfectly smooth hemispherical void in the vessel's structure. Despite these losses, the Imperial fleet maintained its assault, recognizing that the Will of Eternity represented an existential threat to Cadia itself. The battle barge Fist of Ma Crag, commanded by Captain Cato Sicarius of the Ultramarines, executed a daring attack run that brought it within minimum firing distance of the fortress. The Fist's bombardment cannon fired specially consecrated shells developed by Archmagos Call specifically to disrupt the warp-based technologies used by the Blackstone Fortress. These shells temporarily destabilized a section of the fortress's defensive field, creating an opening that Imperial tacticians immediately recognized as their only chance to deliver a decisive blow. Admiral Quarren ordered a desperate measure, the deployment of a specially modified Desolator-class battleship, the Hammer of the Emperor, as a suicide weapon. The Hammer, its reactors modified to overload on command, accelerated toward the breach in the Will of Eternity's defenses. The sacrifice of the Hammer and its 30,000 crew members appeared briefly to succeed. The massive explosion as the battleship's reactors detonated created a flare visible across the entire Cadian system. The Will of Eternity disappeared within the conflagration, and for several hours, Imperial forces dared to hope that the threat had been eliminated. This hope proved tragically misplaced. When the debris field cleared, the Blackstone Fortress remained intact, though it had suffered damage to 2 of its 6 pylons. More concerning to Imperial observers, the remaining pylons had begun emitting a distinctive energy pattern that Archmago's call immediately recognized as resonating with the frequency of the Cadian pylons. This resonance created increasing disruption in the pylons' energy matrix, weakening their warp suppression effect across the entire planet. The fortress's survival demonstrated the thoroughness of Abaddon's preparations. Examination of battle-picked captures revealed that the Will of Eternity had been retrofitted with multiple redundant systems and specialized defensive technologies gathered from across the galaxy. Dark Mechanicum modifications were evident in its adaptive shield generators, which analyzed incoming fire and reconfigured defensive fields to counter specific weapon types. Chaos sorcery manifested in the writhing runes that covered portions of its hull, creating overlapping layers of warp protection that conventional weaponry simply could not penetrate. Most disturbing were the biological components integrated into the fortress's structure. Gigantic, vaguely humanoid forms could be glimpsed moving within transparent sections of the hull, entities that Ordo Malleus representatives identified as enslaved navigators, their mutated bodies grotesquely enlarged and integrated directly into the fortress's guidance systems. These unfortunate beings, their third eyes permanently forced open, created a constant warp interface that allowed the fortress to partially exist in both real space and the Imperium simultaneously, making conventional attacks even less effective. The psychic preparations Abaddon had made to weaponize the Blackstone fortress against Cadia went beyond mere technological modifications. Throughout the siege, specialized Chaos Covens performed elaborate rituals at key locations across Cadia's surface, establishing a sympathetic connection between the Will of Eternity and the pylons. These rituals, incorporating thousands of sacrificial victims taken from Cadia's civilian population, created a network of warp conduits that the fortress could target with unprecedented precision. The Dark Apostle Erebus, one of Abaddon's most valuable lieutenants, personally oversaw these preparations. His knowledge of corrupting rituals, refined over 10,000 years since his pivotal role in Horus's fall, allowed him to identify the precise harmonic frequencies needed to disrupt the pylon's operation. Each ritual site became a beacon that guided the Will of Eternity's targeting systems, ensuring that when the fortress finally unleashed its main weapon, the effect would cascade throughout the entire pylon network. Imperial attempts to disrupt these rituals met with limited success. The Space Wolves' Third Company, led by Wolf Lord Sven Bloodhowl, destroyed a major ritual site in the Cassican Wastes, slaughtering the Word-Bearer's Coven and its thousands of cultist attendants. The backlash from the interrupted ritual created a warp anomaly that consumed nearly half the Space Wolf force, but their sacrifice delayed the completion of the targeting network by several crucial days, buying time for Belisarius Call's work at the central pylon control node. The Sisters of Battle from the Order of Our Martyred Lady, led by Canoness Genevieve, achieved similar success against a ritual site near the Elysian Fields. Their faith-based powers proved particularly effective against the sorceress protections established by the ritual leaders, allowing them to penetrate defenses that had repelled even Space Marine assaults. The Canoness herself confronted and defeated a Lord of Change that had been summoned to oversee the ritual, her null maiden blade severing the demon's connection to the Imperium. Despite these isolated victories, the overall situation deteriorated rapidly. As more pylons fell under Chaos control or suffered damage from targeted strikes, warp phenomena began manifesting with increasing frequency across Cadia's surface. Localized reality breaches allowed demons to materialize without the usual requirements of summoning rituals or sacrifices. In some areas, the laws of physics began breaking down entirely. Gravity fluctuated unpredictably, time flowed at different rates in adjacent locations, and solid matter occasionally phased temporarily into energy states. These manifestations confirmed what Archmago's Call had already determined through his study of the pylon network. The structures were not merely weapons or tools, but fundamental stabilizers of reality, in a region where the barrier between real space and the warp had always been thin. Their progressive failure threatened not just military defeat, but the complete collapse of real space integrity throughout the Cadian Gate region. The Will of Eternity's final positioning maneuver brought it into geosynchronous orbit directly above the largest concentration of pylons in the Elysian fields. From this position, the fortress began its primary firing sequence, the remaining 4 pylons aligning to direct their energy toward Cadia's surface. The beam that emerged from the fortress's central core defied conventional description. Imperial observers reported it as simultaneously blinding white and absolute black, a paradoxical visual effect that caused severe mental distress in those who witnessed it directly. Where this beam struck the surface, it created a perfect circular crater 10 kilometers in diameter, penetrating deep into Cadia's crust. More significantly, it established a direct warp conduit to the subterranean energy matrix that connected all major pylons. The effect cascaded throughout the network, causing pylons across the planet to emit erratic energy pulses as their carefully calibrated systems were thrown into disarray. The strategic brilliance of Abaddon's approach became fully apparent in this moment. Rather than attempting to destroy each pylon individually, a task that would have required far more resources than even his massive fleet possessed, he had identified the single point of vulnerability in the entire network. By striking at the energy matrix itself, he effectively turned the pylons' interconnected nature against them, using their own power distribution system to transmit the corrupting influence of the Will of Eternity across the entire planet. As the Blackstone Fortress continued its assault, the fate of Cadia hung in the balance. The pylons, designed millions of years ago by the Necrons to contain and control the powers of the Imperium, now faced a weapon created from similar technology but perverted to the opposite purpose. The ancient conflict between order and chaos, materium and immaterium, played out on a planetary scale as these two manifestations of Blackstone technology clashed in a battle that would determine the future not just of Cadia, but potentially of the entire Imperium. The Will of Eternity's devastating beam continued to bore into Cadia's surface, the impossible energy, neither fully material nor entirely warp-based, penetrating deeper into the planet's crust with each passing moment. The perfect circular crater expanded to 12 kilometers in diameter as the beam's intensity increased, vaporizing everything in its path. Magma began welling up from the planet's mantle, creating a molten lake that glowed with unnatural colors as it interacted with the Blackstone Fortress's energy. At strategic command in the reinforced bunkers beneath Kasser Craft, Augur operators reported catastrophic readings from monitoring stations across the planet. The pylon network, which had stood for millions of years maintaining reality's stability around the Eye of Terror, was experiencing cascading failures unlike anything previously recorded. Each pylon affected by the Will of Eternity's beam began emitting erratic energy signatures, their normally stable output patterns degenerating into chaotic pulses that further destabilized neighboring structures. Archmago's Belisarius Call, monitoring these effects through specialized equipment linked directly to his augmented sensorium, identified the pattern of failure spreading through the network. The Blackstone Fortress had targeted what Necron architects had designated as a prime nodal confluence, essentially a control hub where the energy flows from multiple pylon clusters converged. This strategic strike demonstrated Abaddon's profound understanding of the network's architecture, knowledge that should have been impossible for any entity not involved in the pylon's original construction. The immediate effects of the pylon network's disruption manifested in increasingly severe reality distortions across Cadia's surface. In the Craft Highlands, Imperial Guard artillery crews reported that their shells sometimes took minutes to impact targets only kilometers away, traveling through localized time distortions. Near the southern polar region, an entire Mechanicus research outpost phased partially into the warp, with survivors describing glimpses of impossible geometries and entities that defied comprehension watching them from just beyond a membrane-thin reality barrier. Most alarming were the reports from the Elysian fields, where the largest concentration of pylons stood. The massive black monoliths, normally inert except for the subtle energy fields they projected, began displaying physical changes. Microscopic fractures appeared in their previously impervious surfaces, spreading like web patterns as the disruption intensified. The characteristic green energy that occasionally pulsed through their internal structures turned a sickly purple, indicating fundamental changes in their operational parameters. Tectonic instability followed the pylon's deterioration. The planet's crust, already under stress from the Blackstone Fortress's direct assault, began shifting along fault lines that had been dormant for millennia. Seismic monitoring stations registered increasing tremor activity spreading outward from the impact site in concentric waves. These weren't natural earthquakes, but deliberate disruptions of the geomantic energy, pathways that the Necrons had established to power and stabilize the pylon network. Lord Castellan Creed, recognizing the existential threat these developments posed, ordered the implementation of Contingency Protocol Omega, the complete evacuation of all non-essential personnel from the planet. This decision, made with the grim calculation that characterized all of Creed's strategic choices, acknowledged what many had already begun to suspect. Cadia's structural integrity as a planet was now fundamentally compromised. The fortress world that had stood as the Imperium's bulwark for 10,000 years might not survive the current assault. The evacuation proceeded under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Void-worthy vessels of every classification, from massive Imperial Navy transports to civilian merchant ships, began loading refugees while still under fire from Chaos forces. The orbital lanes became congested with ships attempting to break through the increasingly sporadic Chaos blockade, creating targeting challenges for both sides as civilian and military vessels intermingled in desperate flight patterns. On the ground, the situation deteriorated rapidly as the planet's geological stability continued to collapse. Massive fissures opened in the landscape, some extending for hundreds of kilometers and reaching depths that penetrated the upper mantle. These chasms divided military units and severed supply lines, creating isolated pockets of resistance that could no longer coordinate effectively. In some locations, the ground simply liquefied as reality itself began to lose coherence, swallowing entire tank battalions and fortifications in moments. The pylon at Elysian Prime, the largest and most ancient of the structures, exhibited the most dramatic effects of the network's failure. The massive monolith, standing over 800 meters tall, began emitting pulses of energy visible to the naked eye, concentric rings of force that distorted light and matter as they expanded outward. Each pulse weakened the boundary between real space and the warp, allowing glimpses of the Eye of Terror to become visible in the sky even during daylight hours. Most concerning to Imperial psychers was the effect these pulses had on the Eye itself. The swirling mass of warp energy that had remained relatively contained for 10 millennia began to visibly expand, its boundaries becoming less defined as the pylon's containment effect weakened. Astropathic communications reported similar effects throughout the Cadian Gate region, with navigators on vessels thousands of light-years away detecting changes in the Eye's warp signature. The catastrophic failure of the pylon network created a strategic opportunity that Abaddon immediately exploited. With Imperial forces disorganized by the planet's physical breakdown and the increasing warp phenomena, he launched a coordinated ground assault targeting the remaining Imperial strongholds. Traitor Titans of the Legio Vulcanum advanced across the fractured landscape, their massive weight causing further collapses that created paths through previously impenetrable defensive lines. Kasser Kraf, the last fully functional fortress city, came under assault from 3 directions simultaneously. Death Guard forces approached from the north, their advance preceded by clouds of warp-tainted miasma that killed vegetation and corroded metal on contact. Word-bearers' columns struck from the east, their ranks bolstered by summoned demons that materialized with increasing ease as the pylon's suppression effect continued to deteriorate. From the west came the Black Legion itself, led by Abaddon's chosen champion Urcanthos, whose Terminator armored elite formed the spearhead of the assault. The defenders fought with the desperate courage of those who know they face extinction. Cadian shock troops held firing positions until their positions were physically obliterated, often calling artillery strikes on their own locations when overrun. Space Marine chapters fought side by side despite doctrinal differences, their ancient rivalries forgotten in the face of imminent defeat. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus Scitarii, normally deployed with cold logical precision, exhibited something approaching sacrificial zeal as they formed living barriers against chaos advances. In orbit, the situation proved equally dire. The Will of Eternity, having completed its primary attack run, repositioned to target the largest concentration of evacuation vessels. Admiral Quarren, commanding the remnants of Battle Fleet Cadia from the battle-damaged cruiser Throne Eternal, ordered his remaining capital ships to form a defensive screen between the Blackstone Fortress and the evacuation corridor. This action, which effectively sacrificed the fleet's heaviest assets, created a brief window during which thousands of civilian ships could break orbit. The Blackstone Fortress's secondary weapon systems proved almost as devastating as its main beam. Lances of dark energy scythed through void shields as if they didn't exist, while specialized torpedoes created localized warp rifts on impact that consumed vessels from within. The battle barge Sword of Defiance, attempting to close with the fortress and deploy boarding torpedoes, suffered catastrophic reality distortions that caused portions of the vessel to age thousands of years in seconds, structural components crumbling to dust even as crew members in adjacent compartments remained unaffected. As the orbital battle reached its crescendo, the physical breaking of Cadia accelerated beyond even the most pessimistic projections. The crater created by the Will of Eternity's initial strike expanded exponentially as secondary magma chambers collapsed into the wound. Massive tectonic plates began shifting laterally, creating shearing forces that no structure, natural or artificial, could withstand. The oceans, already destabilized by the gravitational fluctuations caused by the pylon's failure, sloshed across continental boundaries in tsunamis that reached heights of over a kilometer. The Elysian Fields, site of the largest pylon concentration and Belisarius Call's desperate attempt to stabilize the network, suffered the most dramatic transformation. As the ground beneath the ancient structures liquefied, the massive monoliths began toppling in sequence, each fall triggering sympathetic collapses throughout the network. The energy contained within the pylons, no longer properly channeled, released in massive bursts that further accelerated the planet's destruction. Archmago's Call, recognizing that his original plan to reactivate the network had become impossible, shifted to a desperate contingency: data collection. The ancient tech priest deployed specialized servo skulls and data-gathering servitors throughout the collapsing pylon field, capturing readings that might allow the Adeptus Mechanicus to replicate the technology elsewhere. This information, combined with the Cadian pylon matrix keystone he had brought to the planet, represented the only potential salvage from the catastrophe, knowledge that might eventually allow the Imperium to create new barriers against the expanding Eye of Terror. The planet's structural integrity reached a critical threshold 28 hours after the Will of Eternity's initial strike. Deep within Cadia's mantle, the tectonic disruptions triggered chain reactions in the planet's core, causing pressure buildups that could no longer be contained by the weakened crust. Massive volcanic eruptions began across the entire surface, not following natural fault lines, but emerging wherever reality had thinned sufficiently for the planet's molten heart to break through. These eruptions created new hazards for the ongoing evacuation efforts. Ash clouds rose into the upper atmosphere, creating navigation hazards for vessels attempting atmospheric entry or exit. Pyroclastic flows overtook refugee columns, while lava rivers cut off established evacuation routes. The Cadian 8th Regiment, holding a critical spaceport against Word-Bearer's attackers, found themselves surrounded not just by enemy forces, but by advancing walls of molten rock that consumed defensive positions and created ever-shrinking perimeters. Lord Castellan Creed, coordinating the defense from a mobile command center as Cassar craft began to collapse, prioritized the protection of evacuation zones with the remaining heavy assets. Shadow Sword super heavy tanks that might have been better employed against traitor titans were instead positioned to hold back Chaos forces from spaceports. Artillery batteries expended their final ammunition, creating defensive barrages around refugee gathering points rather than targeting enemy concentrations. The sacrifice of these military assets allowed approximately 23% of Cadia's remaining civilian population to reach evacuation vessels, along with roughly 30% of the planet's military forces. The remainder found themselves caught between the planet's physical destruction and the increasingly overwhelming chaos forces. Many chose to die fighting rather than face capture, while others attempted desperate last-minute evacuations in vessels never designed for void travel. In the upper atmosphere, the evacuation fleet encountered increasing resistance as Chaos fighter squadrons targeted the most vulnerable transports. Space Marine Thunderhawks and Imperial Navy Fury interceptors engaged these attackers in swirling dogfights that crisscrossed the burning skies of Cadia. The Dark Angels Ravenwing Squadron, led by Master Samuel on his ancient jetbike, claimed over 80 confirmed kills while escorting a convoy of civilian ships to the designated warp jump coordinates. As the planet's death throes intensified, the Eye of Terror's expansion became visible even to non-psychers. The swirling mass of warp energy, normally contained behind the veil of reality, began bleeding through into real space across an expanding front. This manifestation wasn't limited to Cadia itself. Reports from neighboring systems indicated similar phenomena occurring throughout the region as the pylon's network-wide suppression effect failed completely. The final phase of Cadia's destruction began with a series of catastrophic quakes that registered beyond any established measurement scales. The planet's equatorial region buckled inward as massive sections of crust collapsed into the mantle. The northern hemisphere, where the Will of Eternity's beam had struck, began separating along a roughly circular fault line, the entire section shifting visibly relative to the rest of the planet. Gravity fluctuations became so severe that in some locations, objects and vehicles began floating freely, while in others they were crushed under forces many times normal planetary gravity. From orbit, Imperial vessels witnessed the literal breaking of Cadia as massive fissures encircled the entire planet, dividing its surface into continent-sized segments that began drifting apart. Between these segments, the planet's mantle became exposed to vacuum, creating spectacular eruptions as molten material flash-boiled and froze in expanding clouds of debris. The characteristic shape of Cadia, recognizable from orbital images for 10 millennia, distorted into an irregular mass as its structural integrity finally failed completely. The Will of Eternity, having accomplished its primary objective, began withdrawing toward the Eye of Terror, accompanied by the bulk of Abaddon's fleet. The Despoiler had achieved what 13 previous Black Crusades had worked toward, the destruction of the linchpin holding the Eye of Terror in check. With the pylon's network collapsed and Cadia physically breaking apart, the warp rift would now expand unchecked, potentially splitting the Imperium in two and creating a permanent chaos corridor into the heart of the Emperor's realm. As Cadia fractured beneath their feet, Lord Castellan Creed established his final defensive position at Kasserkraft's primary command bunker. The reinforced structure, designed to withstand orbital bombardment, had become the last rallying point for the scattered Imperial forces still fighting on the dying world. Creed's weathered face, illuminated by the flickering glow of tactical displays, betrayed no emotion as he assessed the increasingly desperate situation. The bunker's armored walls trembled with each new tectonic shift, dust raining from the ceiling as support beams groaned under stresses they were never designed to endure. "Cadia stands while the Eighth holds," Creed muttered, repeating the famous motto of his beloved regiment as he surveyed the tactical hololith. The display showed the rapidly deteriorating situation across what remained of the planet's surface. Red icons representing Chaos forces converged on the few remaining Imperial strongholds, while warning runes indicated catastrophic geological instability spreading outward from the Elysian fields. The Cadian 8th Regiment, veterans of 100 campaigns and personally led by Creed for decades, had been deployed in a defensive perimeter around the last functional spaceport where evacuation ships still loaded survivors. Creed's final orders to the Cadian 8th reflected both tactical brilliance and grim acceptance of reality. He divided the regiment into 3 battle groups, each assigned to hold specific approaches to the evacuation zone. Rather than establishing a single defensive line that could be outflanked or overwhelmed, he created a series of interlocking positions with overlapping fields of fire. Each position was designed to be defensible even when isolated, with pre-sighted artillery coordinates and fallback points carefully plotted to extract maximum casualties from advancing enemy forces. The Lord Castellan's instructions included precise ammunition allocation protocols. Each heavy weapons team received exact specifications for when to engage different target types, ensuring that precious anti-armor rounds weren't wasted on infantry when Traitor Astartes tanks appeared. He ordered the placement of sentinel walkers in concealed positions along probable enemy approach vectors, creating ambush points that could disrupt Chaos advances at critical moments. Most tellingly, he issued no retreat coordinates beyond the immediate fallback positions, a tacit acknowledgement that this would be the regiment's final stand. Cascaran Colonel Jaren Kell, Creed's longtime second in command and bearer of the regimental colors, positioned himself with the central battle group. The grizzled veteran, his face a tapestry of scars from decades of warfare, understood without being told that his duty now extended beyond merely relaying Creed's orders. The Cadian Eighth's colors, bearing battle honors from hundreds of campaigns across 10 millennia, needed to remain visible until the final moment, a symbol of defiance that would inspire the defenders to hold just a little longer, allowing a few more evacuation ships to escape. The first major assault against the Cadian Eighth's positions came from the northeast, where a massive force of World Eater's berserkers charged across the broken landscape. Captain Thade's company, entrenched behind the rubble of what had once been a Mechanicus research facility, held their fire until the Chaos forces were within optimal range. The disciplined volleys of Hellgun fire scythed through the first wave of cultists that preceded the main assault, but barely slowed the traitor Astartes who followed. When the berserkers closed to within 50 meters, Thade triggered the buried demolition charges that Creed had ordered placed the previous day. The carefully placed explosives transformed the battlefield in seconds, creating a series of deep craters that channeled the Chaos charge directly into the heaviest concentration of heavy bolter and autocannon emplacements. For nearly 20 minutes, the northeastern perimeter held against odds that should have overwhelmed them in seconds. When the position finally fell, the surviving defenders executed a fighting withdrawal to their secondary positions, extracting a terrible toll from their pursuers at every step, just as Creed had planned. Similar scenes played out across all three battle groups. The northwestern perimeter, commanded by Major Orlak, repelled 3 separate assaults by Emperor's Children forces before being outflanked by Chaos Raptors, who descended directly into their command post. The southern approach, held by the veterans of 3rd Company under Captain Mannheim, faced a massive armored thrust by Iron Warrior siege tanks. The company's remaining Lima and Russ battle tanks, positioned hull down behind reinforced barricades, destroyed 17 enemy vehicles before being overwhelmed. Throughout these engagements, Creed continued to coordinate the defense from the command bunker, redirecting reserves and fire support with uncanny precision. His understanding of the battlefield extended beyond mere tactical data. He seemed to anticipate enemy movements before they developed, positioning counterattacks at exactly the right moment to disrupt Chaos advances. When a Death Guard flanking maneuver threatened to cut off the western evacuation route, Creed had already dispatched a Hellhound squadron that arrived just as the Plague Marines emerged from a contaminated drainage channel. The effectiveness of this coordination diminished as Cadia's Vox networks failed under the combined stress of physical destruction and warp interference. Creed adapted by deploying his remaining Cacican in 5-man teams as runners, carrying handwritten orders between positions when technological communication became impossible. These elite soldiers, the finest warriors Cadia produced, executed this unglamorous duty with the same discipline they brought to combat, navigating increasingly hazardous terrain as the planet continued to break apart beneath them. 7 hours into the final stand, with evacuation ships still loading under increasingly heavy fire, the command bunker suffered a direct hit from a Chaos Defiler's battle cannon. The armored ceiling partially collapsed, killing several staff officers and destroying much of the remaining communication equipment. Creed emerged from the rubble with a bleeding head wound, but refused medical attention, instead ordering the command staff to relocate to an auxiliary position closer to the spaceport. This move placed him physically closer to the fighting, where his presence could directly inspire the defending troops. The Lord Castellan's appearance on the front line had an immediate effect on morale. Guardsmen who had been on the verge of breaking held their positions with renewed determination when they saw Creed moving among them, his iconic greatcoat dust covered and torn but his bearing undiminished. He carried his personal plasma pistol in one hand and Kel's power sword in the other, the colonel having fallen to a sniper's bullet an hour earlier while rallying a wavering platoon. The sight of their commander willing to die alongside them stiffened the resolve of even the most exhausted defenders. Creed's personal intervention proved decisive when a massive breach occurred in the southeastern perimeter. A Chaos Warhound Titan, bearing the corrupted insignia of Legio Mortis, smashed through the defensive line and began advancing directly toward the crowded landing fields where thousands of civilians still awaited evacuation. With anti-armor assets depleted and no heavy weapons capable of threatening the war machine, Creed personally led a desperate counterattack using the last remaining Chimera transports. The improvised assault force circled the Titan's legs, their multi-lasers ineffective against its void shields, but successful in drawing its attention away from the evacuation zones. Creed directed the vehicles with hand signals from an exposed command position, timing their movements to keep the Titan turning constantly, preventing it from bringing its weapons to bear on the vulnerable transports behind them. This delaying action bought enough time for the last civilian ships to lift off, though 3 of the 5 Chimeras were destroyed in the process. As the final evacuation transports prepared for departure, Creed issued his last formal order to the remaining forces. Cadia stands until we fall, not one step backward. The surviving officers of the Cadian 8th understood the implicit command beneath these words. They were to hold their positions regardless of cost, ensuring the safe departure of the evacuation fleet. No extraction was planned for the defenders themselves. They would buy time with their lives for others to escape. The defense of the last spaceport exemplified the discipline and sacrifice that had made the Cadian shock troops legendary throughout the Imperium. As traitor Astartes from multiple legions converged on their positions, the defenders held their ground despite overwhelming odds. Heavy weapons teams continued firing until their ammunition was exhausted, then joined the line with lasguns and bayonets. Officers who had lost their entire commands formed ad hoc squads from scattered survivors, maintaining unit cohesion even as the battle lines contracted. Creed himself moved constantly between these final positions, his tactical genius evident even in these desperate circumstances. He directed the placement of the few remaining heavy weapons to create kill zones that maximized their effectiveness, personally adjusted firing angles for the last functioning autocannon, and ordered the strategic demolition of structures to channel enemy advances into the teeth of his remaining firepower. Each decision extended the defense by precious minutes, allowing more ships to clear the atmosphere. 9 hours into the final stand, with the spaceport perimeter reduced to a few hundred meters and Chaos forces pressing from all sides, Creed received word that the last evacuation transport had achieved orbit. The Lord Castellan allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction before issuing his final instructions. All remaining defenders were to converge on his position for a last counterattack. This order, recognized by veteran officers as providing a meaningful end rather than a futile last stand, was obeyed with grim determination. The final assault of the Cadian 8th consisted of less than 2,000 troops, the remnants of a regiment that had begun the battle with over 15,000. They advanced not in the disciplined formations for which Cadians were famous, but in a desperate charge led by Creed himself. Their target was the command position established by Abaddon's lieutenant, the Chaos Lord Urcanthos, whose Terminator armored elite had been directing the assault on the spaceport. This last attack achieved surprise through its very audacity. Chaos forces had grown accustomed to the defenders holding static positions and were unprepared for an aggressive advance. The Cadians crashed into the enemy command section with bayonets fixed, their battle cries drowning out even the thunder of the world breaking apart around them. For a brief, glorious moment, they drove the surprised Chaos forces back, with Creed himself cutting down a Terminator champion with Kel's power sword. The success proved short-lived. As Chaos reinforcements flooded into the area, the Cadian attack lost momentum and began to fragment into isolated pockets of resistance. Creed continued fighting at the center of the largest group, rallying his troops by example even as their numbers dwindled. Witnesses reported that the Lord Castellan accounted for at least a dozen enemy warriors personally, his plasma pistol overheating from continuous fire, while his borrowed power sword claimed the heads of 2 Chaos champions. It was in this final desperate melee that Abaddon the Despoiler himself finally confronted Creed. The Warmaster of Chaos, his massive Terminator armor dwarfing even the largest Imperial soldiers, cut through the remaining Cadian defenders with contemptuous ease. The Talon of Horus, ancient relic weapon of the Luna Wolves, sheared through carapace armor as if it were parchment. Drachnian, the demon sword that could kill with a touch, left trails of warp energy that consumed those who merely came close to its blade. Creed faced the architect of Cadia's destruction without hesitation or fear. The Lord Castellan, exhausted and wounded from hours of continuous combat, raised Kel's power sword in defiance as Abaddon approached. Those close enough to hear reported that Creed's final words to the Despoiler were simple: "Cadia stands. It will always stand in memory." Then he launched himself at his vastly more powerful opponent, determined to die as he had lived, fighting for the world he had sworn to protect. The duel was brutally brief. Creed managed a single strike that glanced off Abaddon's pauldron before the Talon of Horus swept toward him in a killing blow. Yet the death that seemed inevitable never came. At the precise moment of Abaddon's strike, reality shifted around the combatants. A figure materialized on the battlefield, tall, metallic, bearing staff and orb that glowed with eldritch energy. Trazyn the Infinite, Necron Overlord and self-proclaimed archaeologist of galactic history, had chosen this moment to intervene. With a gesture from his empathic obliterator, Trazyn opened a tesseract labyrinth, a pocket dimension used by Necrons to capture and preserve specimens of interest. Before either Creed or Abaddon could react, the Lord Castellan was drawn into the dimensional prison, vanishing from the battlefield in a flash of emerald light. The Necron Overlord, his prize secured, disappeared as suddenly as he had arrived, leaving Abaddon momentarily bewildered before his rage reasserted itself. The fate of Ursarkar e Creed, whether true death might have been preferable to eternal preservation in Trazyn's collection, remained unknown to the Imperium. What was certain was that his leadership had allowed thousands of Cadians to escape the dying world, preserving both the population and the martial tradition of the fortress world. Among those evacuees were over 2,000 members of the Cadian Eighth, mostly wounded who had been evacuated earlier or those assigned to escort civilian transports. These survivors would later reform the regiment on distant worlds, ensuring that while Cadia itself fell, the fighting spirit of its defenders lived on. The symbolic importance of the Cadian command's refusal to retreat resonated throughout Imperial space in the years that followed. Cadia stands transformed from a regimental motto to a battle cry adopted by Imperial forces across the galaxy. The image of Creed and the Cadian Eighth making their final stand against overwhelming odds became a powerful propaganda tool, inspiring similar determination in Imperial defenders facing the expanding tide of chaos following the Great Rift's formation. In the final analysis, the defense of Cadia represented both crushing defeat and spiritual victory for the Imperium. The planet itself was destroyed, the pylons failed, and the Cadian Gate, which had held firm for 10 millennia, was irrevocably broken. Yet the manner of that defeat, the stubborn refusal to yield even when victory became impossible, embodied the qualities that had sustained the Imperium through millennia of constant warfare: sacrifice, duty, and unyielding defiance in the face of overwhelming darkness. As the last evacuation ships broke Cadia's deteriorating gravity well, the planet's death throes reached their cataclysmic finale. The continental plates, already fractured beyond recovery, began to separate completely as the core destabilized. Massive energy discharges erupted from the failed pylons, their ancient containment systems releasing 10 millennia of accumulated power in a matter of hours. These energies, neither fully material nor entirely warp-based, interacted with the planet's collapsing structure to create reality distortions visible from neighboring star systems. From the observation deck of the battle-damaged cruiser Emperor's Deliverance, Admiral Quarren watched as Cadia literally tore itself apart. The once proud fortress world split along multiple fault lines, its atmosphere venting into space in vast plumes that momentarily formed shapes resembling screaming faces before dissipating into the void. The oceans boiled away as pressure differentials caused the surface water to simultaneously freeze and evaporate, creating crystalline clouds that reflected the light of distant stars in impossible colors. Most disturbing was the change occurring in the Eye of Terror itself. The ancient warp storm, contained for 10 millennia by the Cadian pylon network, began visibly expanding. Its boundaries, once relatively stable and defined, became fluid and aggressive, tendrils of pure immaterium energy reaching outward like the pseudopods of some vast predatory organism sensing wounded prey. The barrier between real space and the warp, maintained by the pylon's constant suppression field, thinned and then ruptured completely as the last major structures failed. The immediate effect was a massive psychic shockwave that radiated outward from Cadia at impossible speeds, crossing the gulf between stars in moments rather than years. Every psyker within 50 light-years experienced this phenomenon as a deafening scream that transcended physical senses, penetrating directly into their minds with such force that many were driven instantly mad. Astropaths throughout the sector suffered catastrophic neural hemorrhages, their enhanced sensitivity to the warp making them particularly vulnerable to the psychic backlash. Even non-psychers felt the impact. Imperial Navy officers reported crew members experiencing simultaneous nightmares or waking hallucinations as the wave passed through their vessels. On worlds throughout the Cadian Gate region, populations were gripped by inexplicable dread, with documented cases of mass hysteria and suicide clusters occurring even on planets whose inhabitants had no knowledge of Cadia's strategic importance or current situation. The physical manifestation of this psychic catastrophe followed swiftly. The region of space surrounding the former Cadian system began to change in fundamental ways that defied conventional understanding of reality. Stars visible for millennia disappeared from astrogation charts, while new celestial bodies seemingly materialized without explanation. Light itself behaved inconsistently, with some wavelengths traveling faster or slower than others, creating prismatic distortions that made accurate visual observation increasingly difficult. Most alarmingly, the barrier between real space and the immaterium, already weakened by the destruction of the pylons, continued to deteriorate beyond the immediate vicinity of Cadia. The effect spread outward like ripples in a pond, each wavefront weakening the material universe's resistance to warp intrusion. Within days, stable warp routes that had served Imperial shipping for millennia became treacherous or impassable, while new passages opened in regions previously considered navigational dead zones. Aboard the Terran Crusade flagship Sword of Defiance, Navigator Primus Hector Thirsk experienced these changes directly through his third eye. The mutant navigator, whose lineage had guided Imperial vessels through the warp for 20 generations, described the transformation as reality itself becoming fluid, the boundaries between dimensions thinning until they resembled gauze rather than walls. His navigation chamber, specially designed to contain and focus his powers, began experiencing physical anomalies, objects falling upward, chronometers running at different speeds depending on their position in the room, and shadows that moved independently of their casting objects. The full scale of the catastrophe became apparent only when long-range astropathic communications began to be restored, weeks after the initial collapse. Reports from across the galaxy described similar phenomena occurring simultaneously along a vast arc that stretched from the segmentum obscurus through the segmentum ultima and into the eastern reaches of the segmentum tempestus. This arc, which would later be identified as the path of the Cicatrix Maledictum, represented the largest single warp real space interface ever recorded in human history. Mago's Dominus Belisarius Call, who had successfully escaped Cadia with the data collected from the failing pylons, was among the first to recognize the true significance of these developments. The ancient tech priest, whose knowledge of warp physics exceeded orthodox Mechanicus understanding, identified the pattern of reality distortions as consistent with a cascading dimensional collapse triggered by the removal of a critical stabilizing element, in this case, the Cadian pylon network. The pylons were not merely weapons or tools, Call explained to the assembled Imperial leadership aboard the remnants of Battlefleet Cadia. They formed a complex technological ecosystem that maintained dimensional stability across a region spanning thousands of light years. Their destruction has removed the keystone from an arch that has stood since before human civilization. The collapse we are witnessing was precisely what the Necrons designed the pylons to prevent. The Tech Priest's analysis was confirmed by data from observation posts throughout the segmentum. The warp rift that had begun at Cadia continued to expand along predictable vectors, following paths of least resistance through the fabric of reality. These paths corresponded to ancient fault lines in the material universe, regions where the barrier between dimensions had been damaged by previous cataclysmic events such as the fall of the Eldar or the birth of the Eye of Terror itself. Most concerning was the speed of the expansion. Initial projections had suggested that the effects might be contained within the immediate region surrounding the Cadian Gate, allowing Imperial forces time to establish new defensive perimeters. Instead, the rift propagated at an exponential rate, covering distances that should have taken centuries to traverse in a matter of weeks. This acceleration suggested that the destruction of Cadia had not merely created a new warp storm, but had triggered a reaction in the underlying structure of reality itself. The consequences for Imperial navigation and communication became immediately apparent. Battle groups responding to Cadia's distress call found themselves unable to reach their intended destinations, their navigators reporting that familiar warp routes had simply ceased to exist. Supply convoys bound for worlds near the expanding rift disappeared without trace, while others emerged from the warp at locations thousands of light years from their intended exit points, their chronometers showing journey times that defied rational explanation. Astropathic communication across the affected region became increasingly unreliable, with messages taking weeks to traverse distances that had previously required only days. More disturbing were the cases where messages arrived before they were sent, creating temporal paradoxes that further destabilized local reality. Some astropaths reported receiving transmissions that appeared to originate from alternative timelines or realities, describing events and persons that had no counterpart in recorded history. The most profound strategic implication became clear approximately 3 months after Cadia's fall, when long-range augur stations confirmed what many had feared. The expanding warp rift had effectively bisected the Imperium, creating 2 distinct regions with no reliable method of communication or travel between them. The northern half, which included Terra and the core worlds of the Imperium, retained relatively stable warp conditions. The southern portion, which would come to be known as Imperium Nihilus, or the Dark Imperium, faced increasingly severe warp disturbances that made centralized governance nearly impossible. Planetary governors and sector lords in Imperium Nihilus found themselves effectively cut off from Terra's authority and resources. Worlds that had relied on regular supply shipments faced immediate shortages of critical materials, while industrial planets dependent on imported raw materials saw production lines grind to a halt. The disruption of tithe collection threatened the economic foundation of imperial governance, while the inability to rapidly deploy military forces created strategic vulnerabilities that enemies of mankind quickly exploited. The psychological impact on imperial populations proved equally devastating. For 10,000 years, the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon powered by the Emperor's will, had provided both practical navigation guidance and spiritual reassurance to humanity. Now, across Imperium Nihilus, this constant presence was dramatically weakened or entirely absent. To populations raised in the Imperial Creed, this spiritual darkness represented abandonment by the Emperor himself, triggering crises of faith that chaos cults eagerly exploited. Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax, who had escaped Cadia aboard Saint Celestine's vessel, documented the spread of messianic cults throughout the affected regions. These movements, often led by self-proclaimed prophets claiming direct communication with the emperor, offered alternative interpretations of the catastrophe that ranged from the heretical to the apocalyptic. Some preached that the emperor had deliberately separated the worthy from the unworthy, while others claimed that the time of ending foretold in ancient scriptures had finally arrived. The most dangerous of these cults promoted active collaboration with Xeno's species or even Chaos forces, arguing that the Imperium's traditional xenophobia and rigid orthodoxy had brought divine punishment. Greyfax's reports detailed dozens of worlds where such movements had gained sufficient following to threaten imperial control, requiring immediate inquisitorial intervention to prevent full-scale rebellion or worse, demonic incursion facilitated by misguided human agents. For psychers throughout Imperium Nihilus, the birth of the Cicatrix Maledictum created unprecedented challenges and dangers. The thinning of the barrier between real space and the warp made them more vulnerable to possession and corruption, while the increased warp turbulence made controlled use of their abilities increasingly difficult. Sanctioned psychers reported that even basic techniques taught by the Scholastica Psychona became unpredictable, with simple divinations sometimes triggering catastrophic psychic phenomena. The Black Ships, which had for millennia collected psychers from across the Imperium for transport to Terra, could no longer reach many worlds in the affected regions. This interruption of the collection system led to dangerous accumulations of untrained psychers on numerous planets, creating conditions ripe for mass possession events or the emergence of rogue psyker cabals. Several frontier worlds reported entire settlements destroyed when local psychers lost control of their abilities, their untrained minds becoming gateways for warp entities. Perhaps most concerning were the prophetic visions experienced by psychers throughout the galaxy in the immediate aftermath of the Rift's formation. These visions, remarkably consistent despite occurring across vast distances, depicted a galaxy in flames, besieged by threats both familiar and utterly alien. Recurring motifs included a golden figure rising from an ancient throne, armored giants emerging from stasis tombs, and vast swarms of chitinous organisms descending upon defenseless worlds. The Ordo Chronos identified these visions as potential glimpses of multiple possible futures, suggesting that the birth of the Cicatrix Maledictum had created a temporal nexus point where numerous potential timelines converged. For the Adeptus Astartes, whose chapter organization had ensured relatively autonomous operation for millennia, the strategic challenges posed by the Great Rift were particularly acute. Approximately half of all Space Marine chapters found themselves in Imperium Nihilus, cut off from their traditional supply lines and recruitment worlds. The chapters of the Ultima founding, still in their formative stages when the Rift appeared, faced the additional challenge of establishing their identities and traditions without the guidance of parent chapters, now separated by impassable warp storms. The Dark Angels, whose fortress monastery the Rock had been in transit when the Rift formed, found themselves in a uniquely advantageous position. The massive space station, which contained technologies dating back to the Dark Age of technology, possessed warp engines powerful enough to navigate the turbulent regions near the Great Rift's boundaries. Supreme Grand Master Azrael quickly recognized the strategic value of this capability, establishing the Rock as a mobile command center that could coordinate Imperial responses on either side of the divide. For the Astra Militarum, the logistical nightmare created by the Great Rift threatened to unravel 10 millennia of organizational structure. Regiments deployed far from their homeworlds found themselves unable to rotate out or receive reinforcements, while training worlds could no longer distribute their graduates to units requiring replacement troops. The Adeptus Munitorum, already burdened by Byzantine bureaucracy, struggled to adapt its centralized supply system to a galaxy where reliable interstellar transport could no longer be assumed. The Cadian regiments that had escaped their dying world faced a particularly poignant challenge. Without Cadia itself to serve as their recruitment and training base, the future of these storied units hung in the balance. Lord General Militant Devlin Costellus, senior surviving officer of the Cadian military hierarchy, established a temporary headquarters on the world of New Cadia in the Agrippina sector. From this base, he began the process of consolidating surviving Cadian forces and establishing new training protocols that would preserve the distinctive fighting style and traditions of the Cadian shock troops. The Adeptus Mechanicus, with its distributed forge world network and relatively self-sufficient industrial bases, initially appeared better positioned to weather the crisis than other imperial organizations. However, the disruption of established supply chains quickly revealed critical dependencies that threatened production capacity throughout the Imperium. Forge worlds specialized in particular components found themselves unable to complete complex systems without parts from facilities now isolated on the opposite side of the Great Rift. The standard template construct fragments that formed the technological backbone of Imperial manufacturing were unevenly distributed, with some crucial designs now inaccessible to forge worlds that required them. Archmago's Dominus Belisarius Call, whose understanding of the Cicatrix Maledictum exceeded that of most Imperial authorities, recognized that the catastrophe also presented unique research opportunities. The Tech Priest established monitoring stations along the Rift's boundaries, collecting data on the interaction between real space and the Imperium that would have been impossible to gather under normal conditions. This information, combined with the knowledge extracted from the Cadian pylons before their destruction, formed the foundation for technological innovations that would eventually help the Imperium adapt to the new galactic reality. The strategic implications of the Great Rift extended beyond the Imperium to affect all major galactic powers. The Eldari, whose webway network provided transportation independent of warp travel, found many of their ancient pathways disrupted or corrupted by proximity to the expanding rift. Craftworlds that had maintained careful isolation for millennia were forced into unexpected alliances as established routes became impassable, requiring new navigational approaches through territories controlled by potential enemies. For the Necrons, whose ancient empire had created the Cadian pylons and similar structures throughout the galaxy, the formation of the Cicatrix Maledictum represented both crisis and opportunity. Dynasty lords who had opposed the destruction of the pylons, recognizing their value in containing warp influence, accelerated their awakening schedules to address the growing threat. Others saw the Imperium's disarray as an ideal moment to reclaim worlds lost during their Great Sleep, launching expansionist campaigns against human worlds suddenly cut off from Imperial support. Human navigator houses, whose genetic mutations allowed them to guide vessels through the warp, found their abilities both more valuable and more dangerous in the wake of the Great Rift's formation. The increased warp turbulence required greater skill and concentration to traverse safely, leading to higher rates of navigator burnout and mental collapse. Several minor houses were effectively destroyed when their most experienced navigators died, attempting particularly hazardous passages, while the major houses consolidated power by absorbing their competitors' assets and territories. Amid this galactic upheaval, a new term entered the lexicon of Imperial citizens and military forces alike, the Cicatrix Maledictum. This High Gothic designation, which translated roughly as the Accursed Wound, captured both the physical reality of the galaxy spanning Warp Rift and its spiritual significance to a population raised in the Imperial Creed. The name originated in an astropathic transmission from Terra itself, suggesting that the High Lords, or perhaps even the Emperor's Tarot, had recognized the fundamental nature of the catastrophe. For those with historical knowledge reaching back to the Great Crusade, the Cicatrix Maledictum represented a devastating setback to the Emperor's original vision. The unification of humanity across the galaxy, pursued at incalculable cost through millennia of warfare, had been physically sundered by a single strategic blow. Abaddon's destruction of Cadia had achieved what Horus himself had failed to accomplish: the fragmentation of the Imperium into isolated regions that could no longer support each other against the myriad threats facing mankind. In the immediate aftermath, as Imperial forces struggled to comprehend the full scale of the disaster, a grim realization settled over military and civilian leadership alike. The galaxy had entered a new era of darkness. The relative stability of the previous 10 millennia, maintained through constant vigilance and sacrifice, had been shattered in a single stroke. What would emerge from this catastrophe remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: the Imperium of Man would never be the same again. The smoldering remains of Cadia disappeared into the distance as the Thetis broke away from the dying world, its engines straining under emergency power. The vessel, a sleek, well-maintained transport rather than a warship, carried 3 figures whose significance to the Imperium far outweighed the modest appearance of their conveyance. Saint Celestine, the living saint whose radiance had briefly held back the tide of darkness on Cadia. Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax, her stern countenance betraying no emotion as she watched the destruction through a viewport. And Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call, the ancient tech priest whose hunched, multi-limbed form occupied a specially reinforced chamber filled with arcane equipment salvaged from the Elysian fields. The Thetis had not been their planned escape vessel. The original extraction had called for evacuation aboard the Imperial Fist Star Fortress Phalanx, but the massive battle station had sustained critical damage during the final orbital engagement, forcing it to make an emergency warp jump before the trio could reach it. The Thetis, a requisitioned Mechanicus survey vessel with unusually powerful engines for its size, had been Captain Fabian's contingency plan, one that now carried the fate of the Imperium in its cramped confines. As the vessel pushed farther from the expanding shockwave of Cadia's destruction, Navigational Officer Jeremiah Keld reported increasingly severe warp disturbances throughout the region. The destruction of the Cadian pylons had created turbulence in the Imperium unlike anything recorded in Imperial naval history. Vortices of pure warp energy manifested in real space, while gravitational anomalies pulled the Thetis off course despite the helmsman's best efforts. Warp translation in current conditions represents an 87.23% probability of catastrophic navigation failure, reported the ship's Mechanicus liaison, his voice flat despite the dire implications of his analysis. The traditional escape routes from the Cadian system had collapsed entirely, while new, unmapped currents in the warp created navigational hazards that even the most skilled navigator would struggle to overcome. The situation deteriorated further when long-range augurs detected a pursuit force of Chaos vessels breaking away from the main fleet to hunt down survivors. 3 Iconoclast-class destroyers, their hulls adorned with the blasphemous symbols of the Black Legion, adjusted course to intercept the Thetis. With minimal weapons and compromised void shields, the transport stood no chance against even a single such vessel, let alone 3 hunting as a pack. It was at this moment of apparent doom that the first unexpected intervention occurred. A sleek vessel of unmistakably Xenos design slipped into real space less than 20 kilometers from the Thetis. Its midnight blue hull reflected no light, while its profile, elongated, organic, and studded with crystalline protrusions, identified it immediately as Eldari in origin. Before Captain Fabian could even order defensive measures, the Xenos vessel broadcast on Imperial frequencies. The message came not in the musical tones of the Eldari language, but in flawless, if strangely accented, low Gothic. Imperial vessel, adjust course to coordinates being transmitted. Follow precisely or face destruction from those who pursue you. We offer passage through the storm. Inquisitor Greyfax immediately objected to placing their fate in Xeno's hands, her Ordo Hereticus training categorically rejecting cooperation with any non-human intelligence. Saint Celestine, however, intervened with uncharacteristic directness, informing the Inquisitor that she had foreseen this moment in visions granted by the Emperor. The living saint's golden armor seemed to glow more intensely as she spoke, her certainty brooking no argument even from the formidable Inquisitor. Belisarius Call, whose understanding of xenotechnology far exceeded orthodox Mechanicus doctrine, provided the final word that decided their course. The Eldari vessel employs webway technology, a transportation system independent of warp travel. Given current conditions, it represents our only viable escape vector. The ancient tech priest's analysis, delivered through a Vox grill that had been upgraded countless times over his millennia-long existence, carried the weight of calculation rather than opinion. Captain Fabian, faced with certain destruction from the approaching Chaos vessels against the uncertain alliance with Xenos, ordered the helmsman to follow the transmitted coordinates. The Thetis adjusted course, its engines straining as it accelerated toward a region of space that appeared empty to conventional augurs, but which calls more sophisticated sensors detected as a localized reality distortion, the entrance to a webway gate. As the transport approached the invisible threshold, the Eldari vessel fired precision lance beams that struck the pursuing Chaos ships with unerring accuracy. The weapons targeted propulsion systems rather than attempting outright destruction, crippling the lead destroyer and forcing the others to take evasive action. This delaying tactic bought just enough time for the Thetis to reach the coordinates where reality itself seemed to fold inward, creating an aperture rimmed with coruscating energy. The transition into the webway subjected the Imperial vessel to physical stresses it had never been designed to withstand. The hull groaned as dimensional forces pressed against its structure, while electrical systems fluctuated wildly. In the navigation chamber, Officer Keld collapsed with blood streaming from his eyes, the result of attempting to perceive with his navigator abilities a realm that existed perpendicular to both real space and the warp. Once fully within the webway, the Thetis found itself traversing a tunnel of impossible architecture. The passage appeared simultaneously organic and constructed, its walls flowing like liquid while maintaining geometric precision that suggested conscious design. Arches of bone-like material supported ceilings that seemed to extend infinitely upward, while the floor beneath the vessel shimmered with energy patterns that formed and dissolved in complex, apparently meaningful configurations. The Eldari vessel, now positioned ahead of the Thetis, transmitted further instructions: maintain exact distance, deviate neither left nor right. The paths are treacherous to those not born to walk them. The warning proved immediately relevant as the Imperial crew observed branching passages where the tunnel walls became transparent, revealing glimpses of other realms, some recognizable as locations in real space, others clearly demonic domains that hurt the human mind to perceive. Inquisitor Greyfax, whose psychic null abilities made her particularly sensitive to the unnatural environment, reported increasing discomfort as they progressed deeper into the webway network. This place rejects human presence, she noted through clenched teeth. It recognizes us as intruders. Her assessment was confirmed when alarm klaxons sounded throughout the vessel, indicating microfractures developing across the hull, as the webway itself seemed to press inward against the unwelcome human construct. It was during this period of maximum vulnerability that they first encountered their guide and protector, a figure materialized aboard the Thetis's bridge through means that bypassed all security systems and physical barriers. Tall, lithe, and clad in form-fitting armor of iridescent material that shifted colors with each movement, the Eldari female carried herself with the predatory grace of a born warrior. Most striking was her face, beautiful by human standards yet unsettling in its perfection, with eyes that held knowledge far older than her apparent years. "I am Ivrain, emissary of Ennead and herald of the Whispering God," she announced, her voice carrying both authority and a subtle harmonic that made human ears strain to process. "Your survival serves a purpose greater than your limited understanding can encompass, but know that without my intervention, your souls would already belong to she who thirsts." The Eldari's presence provoked immediate tension. Captain Fabian's security detail raised weapons before being waved down by Saint Celestine, while Inquisitor Greyfax's hand remained pointedly near her bolt pistol. Only Belisarius Call showed no alarm, his augmetic eyes studying the visitor with scientific curiosity rather than xenophobic suspicion. Ivrain explained that the webway passage they traversed was deteriorating rapidly due to the formation of the Cicatrix Maledictum. Ancient sections that had remained stable for millennia were collapsing as the warp rift expanded, creating cascading failures throughout the network. The path to their destination, which she identified as Ultramar, the realm of the Ultramarines in the eastern fringe, required navigation through increasingly unstable regions that only an Eldari intimately familiar with the webway could safely traverse. "The fate of your Imperium and my people has become temporarily aligned," Ivrain stated with characteristic Eldari directness. The Great Devourer approaches from one direction, the Despoiler's forces from another, while the Necron dynasties awaken to reclaim what they consider rightfully theirs. In this confluence of extinction-level threats, pragmatism must overcome ancient enmities. Saint Celestine confirmed that her visions aligned with the Eldari's claims. The living saint, whose connection to the emperors will provided a form of precognition that even the most talented imperial psychers could not match, described seeing a thread of gold connecting their current path to events unfolding in Ultramar. This thread, she explained, represented a potential future where the knowledge call carried might reach those with the power to use it effectively. The journey through the webway became increasingly hazardous as they progressed. Twice, the tunnel walls breached entirely, exposing sections to the raw immaterium. During these breaches, demonic entities attempted to board the Thetis, only to be repelled by the combined efforts of Celestine's holy light and Ivrain's strange necromantic abilities, powers that seemed to drain the very essence from warped creatures, leaving them withered husks that quickly dissolved back into the ether. The most serious threat came not from external forces, but from within the Imperial vessel itself. A hidden cultist among the engine crew, implanted long before the mission to Cadia, chose this moment of vulnerability to sabotage the Thetis's propulsion systems. The resulting explosion damaged critical stabilizers that had been maintaining the ship's dimensional integrity within the webway, causing sections of the hull to begin phasing partially out of the artificial reality of the Eldari network. Belisarius Cawl personally intervened, extending mechadendrites from his augmented form to interface directly with the damaged systems. The ancient tech priest, whose knowledge of xenotechnology far exceeded orthodox Mechanicus understanding, managed to stabilize the vessel by improvising a hybrid system that incorporated both Imperial components and crystalline devices provided by Ivrain. This technological collaboration, which would have been considered tech heresy under normal circumstances, represented the pragmatic alliance forming between the human and Eldari representatives. As they approached the terminus of their webway journey, Ivrain revealed more about her own nature and the god she served. Ennead, the Eldari god of the dead, had awakened prematurely due to the destruction of several craftworlds and the subsequent release of souls from their infinity circuits. This divine entity represented the Eldari's last hope against both chaos and extinction, a god formed from the collective souls of their dead, growing in power with each Eldari death, yet offering potential salvation through that same sacrifice. Your Imperium worships a corpse god who sustains himself through the deaths of thousands of psychers each day, Ivrain observed with the cultural arrogance typical of her kind. My people now follow a death god born from our own souls. Perhaps our species are not so different in our desperation. This theological discussion was interrupted when the webway tunnel ahead collapsed entirely, forcing an emergency exit into real space. The Thetis translated into normal space with catastrophic systems failures across all decks, emerging in the Crag system far from their intended arrival coordinates. Immediately, automated defense platforms belonging to the Ultramarines chapter locked weapons on the unidentified vessel, while patrol ships moved to intercept. Ivrain, recognizing the danger, transmitted authentication codes that identified her as a known ally to the Ultramarines, a status apparently earned during previous interactions with the chapter. The defense platform stood down, though the patrol vessels maintained their interceptor positions until Inquisitor Greyfax provided her own Imperial authorization codes. As the damaged Thetis limped toward Crag itself, astropathic communications confirmed what Ivrain had already intimated. The galaxy had changed fundamentally during their journey through the webway. The Cicatrix Maledictum had fully manifested, splitting the Imperium in two and creating unprecedented warp disturbances throughout known space. Ultramar itself faced invasion on multiple fronts, with Death Guard forces under Mortarion laying siege to several key worlds, while Tyranid splinter fleets probed the realm's eastern boundaries. Most significantly, intelligence reports indicated that Robute Gilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, lay in stasis within the Temple of Correction on Crag, mortally wounded by his brother Fulgrim 10,000 years earlier, but never truly dead. This revelation brought new context to their journey, and the cargo Belisarius Call had so carefully protected throughout their escape from Cadia. The ancient tech priest revealed that the container he had brought from Mars contained technology that represented the culmination of 10,000 years of research. The Armor of Fate, a sophisticated life support system designed specifically for Primarch physiology, incorporating both ancient technologies from the Dark Age of Technology and Innovations Call, had developed through his study of the Emperor's original work. The armor alone cannot heal a wound inflicted by a chaos-empowered Primarch, Call explained as the Thetis approached Macragge's orbital docks. But combined with other factors, the presence of a living saint, perhaps, or the psychic energies of a newly awakened Eldari god channeled through its emissary, the impossible becomes merely improbable. The final Imperial vessels fled the Cadian system as the planet broke apart, their engines straining against the gravitational death throes of the once mighty fortress world. From observation decks across the retreating fleet, survivors watched as the home of the Cadian shock troops, humanity's bulwark against chaos for 10 millennia, fragmented into asteroid-sized chunks. The catastrophic destruction of Cadia marked more than the loss of a strategically vital world. It represented the end of an era for the Imperium of Man. The 13th Black Crusade had succeeded where 12 previous attempts had failed. Abaddon the Despoiler had finally achieved his master stroke, not merely destroying a fortress world, but shattering the metaphysical barrier that had contained the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years. As the Cicatrix Maledictum tore reality asunder and spread across the galaxy, the 41st millennium drew to a close in fire and darkness. From this cataclysm, a new age emerged, the era Indomitus. The fall of Cadia created immediate practical challenges for Imperial military forces. The fortress world had served as the primary training ground for some of the Imperium's most elite soldiers. The distinctive Cadian pattern equipment, from their reliable lasguns to their easily reproduced helmets and flak armor, had become standard issue across countless Imperial Guard regiments. More significantly, Cadian tactical doctrines had been adopted throughout the Astra Militarum, with their emphasis on combined arms operations and disciplined fire patterns forming the backbone of Imperial military training. The surviving Cadian military leadership, led by the few senior officers who had been off-world during the attack, gathered on the agri-world of Kasser-Haln in the neighboring Agrippina sector. There, they established the Cadian Military Council to preserve their martial traditions and coordinate the reformation of shattered regiments. Their first proclamation established that while Cadia as a planet might be destroyed, Cadia as a fighting force would endure as long as its soldiers lived. This sentiment quickly crystallized into the defiant rallying cry that spread throughout Imperial space: Cadia stands. The phrase appeared as graffiti in hive cities thousands of light years from the Cadian Gate. Planetary governors incorporated it into speeches rallying populations against chaos incursions. Imperial Guard regiments with no connection to Cadia adopted the slogan on their banners. What began as a regimental motto transformed into a cultural touchstone, a declaration that defeat, even catastrophic defeat, would not break humanity's will to resist. The practical implementation of this defiance took form in the Cadian diaspora. Approximately 1.5 million military personnel and 3 million civilians had escaped the planet's destruction, representing less than 0.1% of Cadia's original population. These survivors scattered across neighboring sectors, with the largest concentrations settling in the Agrippina, Cadian, and Belize Corona sectors. Within 5 years of Cadia's fall, these refugee communities had established training academies that recreated the rigorous Cadian military education system. The Schola Progenium, responsible for training orphaned children for imperial service, played a crucial role in preserving Cadian military culture. Drill abbots of Cadian origin implemented training protocols identical to those used on their lost homeworld, ensuring that the distinctive fighting style would continue. Young cadets learned the same battlefield prayers, hand signals, and combat doctrines that had made the Cadian shock troops legendary. By the 10th year after Cadia's destruction, the first full regiments composed entirely of Cadian-trained soldiers who had never set foot on Cadia itself, took to the field against the enemies of mankind. The material culture of Cadia proved equally resilient. Forge worlds throughout the Imperium had long produced equipment based on Cadian patterns, and this production accelerated after the planet's destruction. The distinctive Cadian pattern lasgun, with its reliable power pack and integrated bayonet lug, remained in production on hundreds of worlds. The easily manufactured Cadian pattern flak armor and helmet became even more widespread, with their designs serving as the template for equipment issued to newly raised regiments across the Imperium. More subtly, Cadian tactical doctrines spread throughout Imperial military institutions. The emphasis on interlocking fields of fire, rapid redeployment of assets, and defensive flexibility had proven effective against Chaos forces for millennia. Military academies from Armageddon to Valhalla incorporated Cadian tactical manuals into their curricula, ensuring that the hard-won knowledge of generations of Cadian officers would not be lost with their world. The symbolic importance of Cadia's last stand transcended mere military significance. The ecclesiarchy recognized the propaganda value of the fortress world's sacrifice, incorporating it into sermons and liturgies across the Imperium. Preachers described how Lord Castellan Creed and the defenders had held their positions even as the planet literally broke apart beneath them, their faith and duty unshaken to the last. These accounts, while sometimes embellished for emotional impact, reinforced the core imperial virtues of sacrifice and unyielding determination in the face of overwhelming odds. Saint Celestine's appearance during the battle added a spiritual dimension that resonated deeply with imperial citizens. The living saint's radiant presence on Cadia became a powerful symbol that the Emperor had not abandoned humanity, even in its darkest hour. Artwork depicting Celestine standing defiant amid the ruins of Kasser Kraf, her flaming sword raised against the darkness, appeared in cathedrals and shrines across thousands of worlds. These images provided spiritual comfort to populations facing the terrifying reality of the Cicatrix Maledictum and the increased chaos activity that followed its formation. The political ramifications of Cadia's fall proved equally significant. For 10 millennia, the High Lords of Terra had maintained the fiction that the Imperium stood unassailable, beset by enemies but fundamentally secure in its dominance of the galaxy. The destruction of one of the most heavily fortified worlds in Imperial space, followed by the sundering of the Imperium itself by the Great Rift, shattered this comforting illusion. The loss of approximately half the Imperium's territory to what became known as Imperium Nihilus forced a fundamental reassessment of Imperial strategic doctrine. This reassessment became even more urgent with the awakening of Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, revived through the combined efforts of Belisarius Cawl, Saint Celestine, and the Eldari emissary Ivrain, surveyed the broken Imperium with dismay. The strategic genius who had written the Codex Astartes immediately recognized that the fall of Cadia represented not merely a military defeat, but an existential threat to humanity's survival. The containment strategy that had held chaos at bay for 10 millennia had failed catastrophically, requiring a complete revision of Imperial grand strategy. Guilliman's response came in the form of the Indomitus Crusade, the largest military campaign undertaken by the Imperium since the Great Crusade itself. Drawing on resources that had been secretly gathered by Belisarius Cawl over 10 millennia, including the Primaris Space Marines, Guilliman launched a 100-year campaign to stabilize the Imperium and push back against the encroaching forces of chaos. This crusade represented a direct response to the strategic reality created by Cadia's fall. The Imperium could no longer rely on static defenses, but must instead take the fight to its enemies. The technological innovations that enabled the Indomitus Crusade had been partly inspired by research conducted on Cadia itself. Belisarius Cawl's study of the Necron pylons had advanced his understanding of the interaction between real space and the warp, knowledge that proved crucial to the development of new warp drive configurations capable of navigating the turbulent conditions created by the Cicatrix Maledictum. The catastrophic failure of the Cadian defensive strategy also influenced the design philosophy behind the new generation of Primaris Space Marines, with greater emphasis placed on offensive capabilities and strategic mobility rather than static defense. For the Adeptus Astartes, the fall of Cadia and the subsequent awakening of Guilliman triggered the most significant organizational changes since the Second Founding. The introduction of Primaris Marines and the establishment of entirely new chapters during the Ultima Founding represented a direct response to the strategic weaknesses exposed by Abaddon's victory. Chapters that had been decimated defending Cadia, such as the Black Templars and Imperial Fists, received Primaris reinforcements that allowed them to rebuild their fighting strength more rapidly than would have been possible through traditional recruitment methods. The Astra Militarum underwent equally profound changes in the wake of Cadia's destruction. The loss of the Fortress World's training facilities created immediate shortages of specialized troops, particularly those skilled in anti-chaos operations. To compensate, the Adeptus Munitorum accelerated recruitment across thousands of worlds, establishing new training regimens based on preserved Cadian doctrines. Regiments that had fought alongside Cadian forces during the 13th Black Crusade, such as the Catachan Jungle Fighters and Vestroyan Firstborn, incorporated Cadian tactical elements into their own doctrines, creating hybrid approaches that combined different imperial military traditions. The survivors of the Cadian shock troops themselves became highly valued assets, dispersed throughout the Imperium to train new regiments and provide expertise in combating chaos forces. Veterans of the 8th Cadian, known as Creed's Own, were particularly sought after as advisors and instructors. Their first-hand experience fighting against the full might of a Black Crusade represented irreplaceable practical knowledge that no training manual could provide. Many of these veterans eventually formed the core of new Cadian pattern regiments, leading from the front and passing their experience directly to the next generation of soldiers. The material legacy of Cadia extended to the study of the Necron pylons that had made the fortress world strategically vital. Belisarius Call's research team had managed to extract crucial data during the final battle, information that proved invaluable in understanding how the ancient Xenos technology had contained the Eye of Terror for millions of years. This knowledge led to the development of smaller, portable devices that could temporarily stabilize reality in regions affected by warp incursions. While far less powerful than the original pylons, these devices provided crucial tactical advantages to Imperial forces operating near the borders of the Cicatrix Maledictum. The cultural impact of Cadia's fall manifested in Imperial art, literature, and music across thousands of worlds. The Lament for Cadia, composed by the renowned Imperial composer Maxim Valerius, became a standard piece performed at military ceremonies throughout the Imperium. Its mournful opening movement, representing the planet's destruction, gave way to a defiant martial theme that embodied the spirit of resistance that survived the catastrophe. Similarly, the epic poem, Castellan's Vigil, detailing Creed's final hours defending the evacuation zones, became required reading in Schola Progenium facilities training future Imperial officers. In the decades following Cadia's destruction, pilgrimage ships regularly visited the debris field that had once been the fortress world. These pilgrimages, organized by the ecclesiarchy, allowed veterans and families of the fallen to pay their respects at the site of humanity's greatest sacrifice in recent history. The largest fragments of the planet became shrines, with chapels constructed in pressure domes where Imperial citizens could pray among the ruins of what had once been mankind's bulwark against chaos. These pilgrimages reinforced the emotional and spiritual significance of Cadia in the Imperial psyche, transforming a military defeat into a religious touchstone. The tactical and strategic lessons of Cadia's fall were codified in new Imperial military doctrines, implemented across both sides of the Cicatrix Maledictum. The catastrophic failure of the static defense strategy that had defined Imperial military thinking for millennia gave way to more flexible approaches emphasizing mobility and offensive operations. Guilliman's military reforms, building on his original Codex Astartes but adapted to the new strategic reality, emphasized the importance of rapid response forces capable of countering chaos incursions before they could establish footholds in real space. Perhaps the most profound legacy of Cadia's fall was the psychological impact on Imperial citizens and military forces. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had maintained the comforting fiction that while beset by enemies on all sides, its fundamental structure remained secure. The destruction of one of its most heavily fortified worlds, followed by the literal splitting of the Imperium by the Cicatrix Maledictum, shattered this illusion of security. Imperial citizens faced the uncomfortable truth that no world, no matter how well defended, was truly safe from the enemies of mankind. Yet from this psychological trauma emerged a renewed determination. The rallying cry "Cadia stands" represented not denial of reality but defiance in the face of it, an acknowledgement that while physical structures might fall, the human spirit would not. This defiance manifested in increased recruitment for Imperial military forces, with many worlds reporting record numbers of volunteers in the years following Cadia's destruction. Citizens who might once have been content to leave the defense of the Imperium to others now recognized their personal stake in humanity's survival. As the era Indomitus progressed and the Indomitus Crusade pushed back against the forces of chaos, the legacy of Cadia transformed from recent tragedy to foundational myth. New generations of Imperial citizens, born after the formation of the Cicatrix Maledictum, grew up with the story of Cadia's last stand as a central element of their understanding of the Imperium's struggle. The fortress world became synonymous with determined resistance against overwhelming odds, a symbol that even in defeat, humanity's defiance could shape the course of galactic history. The fall of Cadia ultimately represented both an ending and a beginning. It marked the conclusion of the strategic paradigm that had defined the Imperium since the Horus Heresy, the containment of chaos through static defenses and the maintenance of the status quo. From the ashes of this approach emerged a more dynamic Imperium under Guilliman's leadership, one forced by catastrophe to innovate and adapt in ways that had been unthinkable for millennia. The destruction of the fortress world thus served as the catalyst for the most significant transformation of the Imperium since its founding, a painful rebirth through fire that would determine whether humanity would ultimately survive in a galaxy more hostile than ever before.